Hey everyone, welcome back to the channel. My name is Vembo and tonight I'm settling in with some gentle stories. The kind that wash over you like a warm breeze on a quiet evening. Whether you're winding down after a long day, looking for something peaceful to drift off to, or just need a moment to breathe, you're in exactly the right place. So grab your favourite drink, get comfortable, and let's explore some stories that feel like gentle exhales for the soul. Our first story comes from someone who discovered that the best adventures sometimes happen when we're not looking for them. The hidden trail with wildflowers. I never considered myself much of an explorer, but last spring I found myself taking longer and longer walks just to clear my head. Work had been stressful, and something about being outside helped me think more clearly. I'd been walking the same route through my neighbourhood for weeks, past the usual houses and familiar street corners, when I noticed something I'd somehow missed before. There was this narrow gap between two large oak trees that lined the main road. It wasn't really a path, more like a suggestion of one, just wide enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. I'd probably passed it 100 times without really seeing it. But that particular morning, the light was hitting it just right, and I could see that it actually led somewhere. I hesitated for a moment, feeling a bit ridiculous for wanting to investigate what was probably just someone's overgrown backyard or a dead end behind a fence. But curiosity won out, and I carefully pushed through the gap, branches catching gently on my jacket. What I found on the other side took my breath away. The narrow space opened up into this hidden meadow that couldn't have been more than an acre, completely surrounded by trees and invisible from any road or house. But it wasn't the size that amazed me, it was what filled it. Wildflowers everywhere, not planted in neat rows like a garden, but growing in natural drifts and clusters, like nature had been painting with colour for years, without anyone watching. There were patches of purple lupines swaying tall near the back, bright orange poppies scattered throughout the grass, and delicate white flowers I couldn't name that seemed to glow in the dappled sunlight filtering through the canopy above. The air smelled sweet and green, with that particular scent that comes from flowers warming in the sun. Bees moved lazily from bloom to bloom, and I could hear birds calling from somewhere deeper in the trees. The ground was soft underfoot, carpeted with fallen petals and new grass. I stood there for what felt like hours but was probably only 20 minutes, just taking it all in. The flowers moved gently in a breeze I could barely feel, creating these subtle waves of colour across the meadow. It was the kind of place that makes you whisper automatically, like you're in a cathedral made of wildflowers and sky. When I finally made myself leave, I carefully marked the spot in my mind, noting the particular shape of the oak trees and the way the gap looked from the road. I was afraid I might not be able to find it again, that it might somehow disappear like something from a dream. But it didn't disappear. I've been back dozens of times since then, in different seasons and different weather. In summer the flowers change, new varieties appearing as others fade. In fall the meadow fills with golden grasses and the last brave blooms of the year. Even in winter it's beautiful, peaceful and stark with frost coating the dried stems. I've never seen another person there. No footprints, no litter, no signs that anyone else knows about this little pocket of wildness hiding in plain sight. Sometimes I wonder if I should tell someone about it, share the discovery, but mostly I just feel grateful that it exists, that there are still secret places in the world waiting to be found by accident on an ordinary morning walk. The meadow has become my thinking place, my reset button when everything else feels too complicated. I'll sit in the grass and watch the flowers sway, and somehow problems that seemed overwhelming start to feel manageable again. It's like the wildflowers know something about taking things one day at a time, one season at a time, that the rest of us have forgotten. That story comes to an end right there. Sometimes the most magical discoveries are hiding right under our noses, waiting for the exact moment we're ready to see them. The idea that this person walked past their own secret garden hundreds of times before finally noticing it feels like the perfect metaphor for how much beauty we miss when we're too busy to really look around. Speaking of unexpected discoveries, this next story takes us on a different kind of journey, one where the weather became part of the experience rather than something to endure. The train ride where it rained the whole way. I'm not usually someone who enjoys long train rides, but I had to get from Portland to Seattle for a family wedding, and flying felt like too much hassle for such a short trip. The forecast called for rain, which seemed typical for the Pacific Northwest in November, so I packed accordingly and settled in for what I assumed would be a routine, slightly dreary journey. The rain started just as we pulled out of Union Station, light drops speckling the windows as the city gave way to smaller towns and then countryside. I'd brought a book and my headphones, planning to lose myself in a podcast or some music, but something about the rhythm of the rain against the glass made me put everything away and just watch. At first, it was just ordinary rain, the kind that makes you glad to be inside somewhere warm. But as we moved north through Oregon and into Washington, the rainfall became steadier, more purposeful. The drops weren't just hitting the windows randomly anymore. They were racing each other down the glass in perfect little streams, constantly merging and separating as the train swayed gently on the tracks. I found myself following individual droplets with my eyes, picking one near the top of the window and watching it gather other drops as it traced its way down. Some would make it all the way to the bottom in one continuous journey, while others would get caught up in the vibration of the train and scatter into smaller streams. The landscape outside became dreamlike through the rain-streaked glass. Forests appeared and disappeared in soft focus, their edges blurred and mysterious. Rivers and streams seemed to multiply, reflecting the grey sky in silver ribbons that wound between hills I could barely make out through the downpour. Even the towns we passed through looked different, softer somehow, like watercolour paintings left out in the rain. The sound was hypnotic, not just the rain on the windows, but the way it mixed with the steady rhythm of the train on the tracks. It created this layered, almost musical backdrop that seemed to slow everything down. Conversations throughout the car became quieter, more intimate. People put away their phones and laptops, settling back in their seats with the same drowsy contentment I was feeling. About halfway through the journey, the rain intensified into what felt like a proper Pacific Northwest downpour. The world outside the windows became completely abstract, just moving colours and shapes behind a curtain of water. But instead of feeling claustrophobic or trapped, there was something deeply comforting about being warm and dry inside our moving shelter, while nature put on its show around us. I noticed other passengers starting to relax in the same way I was. A businessman across the aisle closed his laptop and just stared out the window. A young mother let her toddler press his face against the glass to watch the racing raindrops, and they both got quiet and mesmerized by the patterns. An elderly couple shared a thermos of coffee and pointed out shapes they saw in the blurred landscape, laughing softly at their own imagined discoveries. The train seemed to be moving more slowly than usual, though I couldn't tell if that was actually true or if the rain just made everything feel more leisurely. Time stretched out in the most pleasant way, like we were all suspended in this cocoon of gentle motion and steady rainfall, completely separate from whatever was happening in the rest of the world. When we finally pulled into Seattle's King Street station, I felt genuinely disappointed that the journey was over. The rain was still coming down, and I sat in my seat for an extra few minutes, listening to it drum against the roof and watching the last few drops race down my window. Other passengers were gathering their bags and preparing to rush out into the weather, but I wanted to hold on to that peaceful, suspended feeling for just a little longer. I ended up being 20 minutes late to the wedding rehearsal because I took my time walking from the station, letting the rain soak through my jacket while I tried to carry that train car serenity with me into the busy evening ahead. Even now, whenever I hear rain against windows, I'm transported back to that slow, gentle journey where the weather became the best part of the trip. That story ends there. There's something magical about surrendering to circumstances beyond our control and discovering they were exactly what we needed. That train ride turned into a meditation session disguised as transportation, proving that sometimes the journey really is more important than the destination. Our next story brings us to a daily routine that became something much more meaningful through the simple presence of a faithful friend, the old dog that always waits by the bakery. My morning walk to work takes me down Maple Street, past the same shops and cafes I've been seeing for 3 years since I moved to this neighbourhood. It's a pleasant enough route, tree-lined and quiet, but it had become so routine that I barely notice my surroundings anymore. That changed about 6 months ago when I started really paying attention to one particular resident of the street. There's this bakery called Morning Glory about halfway to my office, the kind of place that always smells like fresh bread and has flower handprints on the windows from enthusiastic bakers. But what caught my attention wasn't the bakery itself. It was the dog that sits beside its front door every single morning. He's an older golden retriever, probably 8 or 9 years old, with a greying muzzle and the kind of patient, wise expression that comes with age. His coat is still thick and beautiful, though not quite as golden as it probably once was. Every morning, without fail, he's positioned himself right next to the bakery's entrance, sitting perfectly straight, with his tail curled around his front paws. At first, I assumed he belonged to whoever owned the bakery, just a shop dog keeping watch over the business. But as I started paying more attention, I realised something wonderful was happening that had nothing to do with guarding property. The dog wasn't there to protect anything. He was there to greet everyone who passed by, and he took this job very seriously. Every person who walked down that sidewalk, whether they were customers heading into the bakery or just people like me passing through on their way to work, received the same enthusiastic greeting. His tail would start wagging the moment he spotted someone approaching, and it would continue wagging until they were completely out of sight. Not the frantic, overexcited wagging of a young dog, but the steady, happy rhythm of someone who was genuinely pleased to see each person who crossed his path. If people stopped to pet him, which many did, he would lean into their touch with obvious appreciation, his eyes closing slightly in contentment. But he never begged for attention or followed people when they continued on their way. He just offered his greeting freely and then settled back into position to wait for the next person. I started making a point of stopping to say good morning to him, and he quickly learned to recognise me. His tail would speed up a little when he saw me coming, and he'd stand up to properly receive his morning pets. I began carrying a small dog treat in my pocket, though I checked with the bakery staff first to make sure it was okay. The woman behind the counter, Maria, told me his name was Buster and that he'd been showing up every morning for over 2 years. He didn't belong to the bakery, but to an elderly man named Frank who lived in the apartment building next door. Frank had started bringing Buster with him on his morning walks to get coffee and a pastry, and Buster had apparently decided that greeting the neighbourhood was his personal mission. Even on days when Frank wasn't feeling well enough for their walk, Buster would find his way to his post by the bakery door. Frank would watch from his 3rd floor window, Maria told me, making sure his dog was safe, while allowing him to continue his self-appointed job as the neighbourhood's official greeter. What struck me most was how Buster seemed to sense what each person needed from him. With hurried commuters like myself, he offered a quick but warm greeting, a moment of connection that didn't delay our schedules. With people who seemed to have more time, like retirees out for morning walks or parents with strollers, he was more interactive, clearly enjoying longer conversations and extended petting sessions. Children were his specialty. I watched him lower himself to the ground when small kids approached, making himself less intimidating while his tail continued its steady, welcoming beat. He had infinite patience for tiny hands pulling gently on his ears, or toddlers who wanted to hug him around the neck. On rainy days, Buster would position himself under the small awning that extended over the bakery's entrance. But he never abandoned his post completely. Even in the worst weather, he'd find a way to offer his greetings while staying reasonably dry. I realised that Buster had become an anchor point in my day, a constant that made the whole neighbourhood feel more like home and less like just a place I happened to live. Seeing his patient, friendly face every morning started each day with a small dose of uncomplicated joy. The story comes to an end there. Buster represents everything we love about dogs and everything we could learn from them about showing up consistently with pure, uncomplicated kindness. His daily presence transformed an ordinary street corner into a place where community happens, one greeting at a time. Our next story takes us to one of those perfect afternoons when the world slows down and the sky becomes entertainment enough. The afternoon I watched clouds drift for hours. I'm not usually the type to just lie around doing nothing, but last summer I found myself with an unexpectedly free Saturday afternoon. My plans had fallen through at the last minute, and instead of scrambling to fill the time with activities, I decided to embrace the emptiness of the day. I grabbed an old blanket from the linen closet and walked to the small park behind my apartment building. It's nothing fancy, just a patch of grass with a few mature oak trees and a playground that's usually busy with families. But that particular afternoon, it was completely empty. Peaceful, in the way that only happens when you're not expecting it. I spread the blanket under one of the larger trees, positioned so I had a clear view of the sky, but still had some shade from the branches above. The grass was soft and recently cut, and there was just enough breeze to keep the temperature perfect. I lay back and looked up, and that's when I really noticed what was happening above me. The clouds were putting on a show. They weren't the flat, boring grey clouds that just sit there looking heavy and threatening. These were the good clouds, the kind that looked like they were painted by someone who understood how to make the sky interesting. Puffy white formations that cast shadows as they moved, creating this constantly changing pattern of light and dark across the landscape. I started following individual clouds as they drifted across my field of vision, and I realised I hadn't really looked at clouds. Really looked at them, since I was a kid. These weren't just random puffs of water vapour. They had personalities, stories written in their shapes. One cluster looked exactly like a dragon, complete with wings spread wide and a long tail trailing behind. I watched it slowly transform as it moved, the wind pulling at its edges until the dragon became something else entirely. Maybe a ship with billowing sails. Then the ship dissolved into wisps that reformed into what could have been a sleeping cat, curled up with its tail wrapped around its body. The longer I watched, the more I started to see. There were castles with towers that crumbled and rebuilt themselves, faces that appeared and disappeared, animals that morphed into other animals as they crossed the blue canvas above me. It was like having access to the world's most creative art gallery, one where the exhibits changed every few minutes. What surprised me was how meditative the whole experience became. Following the slow drift of the clouds required just enough focus to quiet the usual chatter in my head, but not so much that it felt like work. My breathing slowed to match the lazy pace of the afternoon, and I felt tension I didn't even know I'd been carrying start to melt away. Time became irrelevant. I had no idea if I'd been lying there for 30 minutes or 3 hours. The sun moved across the sky, changing the angle of light and creating new shadows, but the clouds kept their steady procession overhead, an endless parade of shapes and possibilities. A family with young children eventually arrived at the playground, and I could hear their voices and laughter mixing with the sound of swings creaking and sneakers on metal slides. But even those sounds felt peaceful, like they belonged to the lazy rhythm of the afternoon. The children's joy added to the contentment rather than breaking it. I think I dozed off at some point, because I remember waking to find the light had changed to that golden quality that comes in the late afternoon. The clouds had shifted too, taking on warmer colours as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. What had been bright white earlier was now touched with pink and orange, like someone had started adding sunset colours to the edges. When I finally rolled up my blanket and headed home, I felt like I'd been on vacation without leaving my neighbourhood. My shoulders were relaxed, my mind was clear, and I had that peaceful tiredness that comes from a day well spent doing absolutely nothing productive. That afternoon taught me something about the value of unstructured time, about what happens when you give yourself permission to just be present without an agenda. The clouds had been putting on that same show every day, but I'd been too busy to notice. Now, I try to make time for more sky-watching afternoons, though none have been quite as perfect as that first accidental discovery. That story ends there. Sometimes the best entertainment doesn't require a screen or a ticket, just a willingness to lie back and let your imagination run wild with whatever nature provides. The fact that this person stumbled into hours of pure contentment just by looking up reminds us how much wonder we miss when we're always looking down at our phones. This next story brings us to a simple pleasure that transformed an ordinary evening into something special. The cup of tea that smelled like honey. I've never been much of a tea person. Coffee has always been my go-to drink, strong and efficient, something to fuel the day rather than savour. But a few months ago, a co-worker brought back a small collection of loose-leaf teas from a trip to a specialty shop in the mountains, and she insisted I take one home to try. The package was simple, just a small brown paper bag with handwritten labels that said Mountain Wildflower Blend. I stuck it in my kitchen cabinet and promptly forgot about it for weeks. It wasn't until I was dealing with a particularly stressful evening, one of those days where everything had gone slightly wrong and I felt too wired for sleep but too tired to do anything productive, that I remembered the tea. I found the bag tucked behind my usual coffee supplies and opened it out of curiosity more than anything else. The smell that escaped was unlike anything I'd expected. It wasn't the sharp, grassy scent I associated with tea, or the medicinal smell of herbal blends I'd tried before. This smelled like liquid sunshine, sweet and warm, with layers of fragrance that seemed to change as I inhaled. There was definitely honey in there, but not the artificial sweetness of flavoured products. This was the deep, complex sweetness of real wildflower honey, the kind that carries hints of whatever flowers the bees had been visiting. I followed the brewing instructions written in careful handwriting on the package. Water heated to just below boiling, steeped for exactly 4 minutes. As the tea brewed, the honey scent intensified and spread throughout my small kitchen, mixing with other subtle fragrances I couldn't quite identify. Maybe chamomile, possibly lavender, definitely something floral that reminded me of late summer meadows. When I finally poured the tea into my favourite mug, the liquid was a beautiful golden colour, clear and bright like captured sunlight. The first sip was a revelation. The taste matched the aroma perfectly. Sweet without being cloying, complex without being overwhelming. It tasted like what I imagined drinking a warm summer evening would be like, but it was the effect on the rest of my evening that really surprised me. Within minutes of finishing that first cup, the stress and tension I'd been carrying all day began to dissolve. Not in the sharp caffeine crash way that happens with coffee, but gradually, like ice melting in warm water. I found myself moving more slowly, more deliberately. Instead of rushing through my usual evening routine, I took my time. I washed the dishes mindfully, actually noticing the warm soapy water on my hands. I dimmed the harsh overhead lights and lit a candle I'd been saving for a special occasion, deciding that a peaceful Tuesday evening was special enough. The honey scent from the tea seemed to linger in the air, transforming my ordinary living room into something cozier, more welcoming. I curled up in my reading chair with a book I'd been meaning to start for months, and for the first time in weeks, I actually read instead of just staring at pages while my mind wandered to work problems and daily stresses. The tea became a ritual after that. Not every evening, but whenever I needed to transition from the demands of the day to the peace of the night. I learned to brew it slowly, to inhale the steam as it steeped, to hold the warm mug in both hands and let the honey fragrance work its quiet magic. I eventually went back to the mountain shop where my co-worker had found the tea, driving 3 hours on a weekend just to stock up. The elderly woman who ran the place told me the blend was her own creation, made from flowers and herbs she collected from the meadows around her home. She mixed each batch by hand, which explained why every cup tasted slightly different, like drinking the essence of a particular day in a particular field. She also told me about the honey she added to the blend, sourced from local beekeepers who let their bees roam freely through wildflower meadows. The bees know which flowers make the sweetest honey, she said with a smile. They're better at creating this blend than I am. I just help them along. I bought enough tea to last months, but I've found myself rationing it, saving it for evenings when I really need that transformation from chaos to calm. Each cup feels like a small ceremony, a way of telling myself that this moment, this evening, this simple pleasure of honey-scented steam rising from a warm mug is enough. That story comes to an end right there. It's amazing how something as simple as the right cup of tea can completely shift the energy of an evening. The way this person discovered not just a new beverage, but a whole ritual for finding peace shows how sometimes the best remedies for stress are hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right moment to reveal themselves. Our next story takes us to a magical evening where an entire community came together to create something beautiful, the lanterns floating down the river. I stumbled across the festival completely by accident on a warm evening in late August. I'd been walking along the river path that runs through downtown, not really going anywhere in particular, just enjoying the cooler air that comes near the water as the sun starts to set. I noticed more people than usual gathered along the riverbank, families with children and elderly couples, groups of friends spreading blankets on the grass. There was an expectant quality to the crowd, like everyone was waiting for something special to begin, but I had no idea what. I found a spot on a small hill overlooking the river and settled in to watch whatever was about to happen. As the sky deepened from blue to purple, volunteers began moving through the crowd, handing out what looked like small paper bags with candles inside. The organizer, a woman with a warm voice that carried easily across the water, explained that this was the annual River of Lights festival, a tradition that had started 5 years ago as a way for the community to mark the end of summer. Each person would light their lantern and release it onto the water, creating a floating constellation that would drift downstream together. When the signal came, hundreds of tiny flames flickered to life along both sides of the river. Children held their lanterns up proudly, adults helped elderly neighbours light their wicks, and for a few minutes the riverbank glowed with warm, golden light reflected in the faces of everyone gathered. Then came the moment of release. One by one, people waded into the shallow water at the river's edge and gently set their lanterns afloat. The paper boats bobbed for a moment, finding their balance, then began their slow journey downstream, carrying their cargo of light into the gathering darkness. What happened next was pure magic. The individual lanterns began to cluster together, drawn by the river's current into loose formations that looked like fallen stars scattered across the dark water. Some moved faster than others, creating streams of light that wove between slower-moving groups. From my position on the hill, it looked like the night sky had somehow been turned upside down, with constellations drifting along the river instead of hanging overhead. The silence was profound. Hundreds of people stood along the banks, but conversation had dropped to whispers. Children who had been running around and playing were now still, mesmerized by the floating lights. Even the dogs seemed to sense the solemnity of the moment, sitting quietly beside their owners as the lanterns continued their journey. I followed the lights as they moved downstream, walking along the path with dozens of other people who couldn't bear to let the spectacle end. The lanterns stayed lit for much longer than I'd expected, their flames protected by the paper walls from the gentle evening breeze. Some burned brighter than others, creating a natural rhythm of light and shadow as they bobbed along the current. As the procession of lights moved further from shore, individual lanterns became harder to distinguish, but the overall effect became even more beautiful. The scattered points of light looked like a river of stars flowing parallel to the water, a second river made of pure luminescence floating just above the surface. I walked along the path for almost a mile, not wanting to lose sight of the lanterns, but eventually they rounded a bend and disappeared into the distance. By that time, most of the other festival goers had headed home, but a small group of us remained, standing together in comfortable silence, still processing what we'd witnessed. A man standing near me said quietly, "I've lived here for 30 years and I've never seen anything more beautiful on this river." An elderly woman nodded and added, "It makes you believe in magic again, doesn't it?" On my walk back to where I'd started, I passed families packing up their blankets and folding chairs, children asking their parents when they could come back next year to float more lanterns. The riverbank still smelled faintly of candle wax and paper, and small groups of people lingered, reluctant to let the evening end completely. I learned later that the lanterns were designed to burn out safely, and the paper would dissolve in the water within a few days, leaving no trace except in the memories of everyone who witnessed their journey. The organisers had worked with environmental groups to make sure the festival wouldn't harm the river or its wildlife, but would still create that sense of wonder and community connection. I've marked next year's festival date on my calendar already. There's something about shared moments of beauty that makes you want to be part of them again, to stand with your neighbours and release light into the darkness, knowing that for one evening at least, the whole community is united in creating something magical together. That story comes to a close right there. There's something deeply moving about a community coming together to literally light up the darkness. The image of hundreds of small flames floating downstream like fallen stars is the kind of sight that stays with you forever, reminding us that sometimes the most profound experiences happen when we gather with others to create beauty just for the sake of it. Our next story brings us to one of those unexpected friendships that form in the most natural way possible. The cat that followed me to the park. I'm not really a cat person, never have been. Dogs, I understand. They're straightforward and social, but cats have always seemed too independent for my taste. So when this small black cat started following me on my daily walks, I wasn't quite sure what to make of it. It started about 2 months ago. I take the same route every afternoon to the small park near my apartment. Nothing fancy, just a loop around a pond with a few benches and some old oak trees. The cat first appeared when I was maybe 3 blocks from home, just sitting on a fence post, watching me walk by. The next day, same thing. Small black cat, bright yellow eyes, perched on that same fence post, like it was waiting for something. When I got closer, it hopped down and started walking alongside me, not right next to me, but parallel, about 10 feet away on the sidewalk. At first, I thought it was just coincidence. Maybe the cat lived in the neighbourhood and we just happened to be heading in the same direction. But after a week of this daily escort service, I started to realise this little cat had appointed itself as my walking companion. It never tried to get my attention or meowed for pets. It just walked when I walked, stopped when I stopped, and seemed perfectly content to maintain that respectful distance between us. If I paused to tie my shoe or check my phone, the cat would sit down and wait patiently until I was ready to continue. The really remarkable thing was how it seemed to know exactly where I was going. When I turned left toward the park, instead of continuing straight, the cat would turn left too, without hesitation. When I took the long way around the pond, it would take the long way too. When I sat on my usual bench overlooking the water, the cat would find a sunny spot about 15 feet away and settle in for what appeared to be its own contemplation time. Other park visitors started to notice our routine. An elderly woman who fed the ducks every afternoon asked me about my cat one day, and I had to explain that it wasn't actually my cat, just a neighbourhood friend who decided we were a team. She laughed and said she'd been watching us for weeks, thinking how nice it was to see such a well-behaved pet. The cat had its own personality quirks that I began to appreciate. It was fascinated by squirrels but never chased them, just watched with intense focus as they scurried up trees or across the grass. It avoided other dogs completely, timing its movements to stay well clear of anyone walking their pets, and it had a particular fondness for the wooden bridge that crossed the pond, always stopping in the middle to peer down at the water below. One rainy afternoon, I decided to skip my walk and was surprised to feel disappointed, not just about missing my exercise, but about breaking our routine. I found myself wondering if the cat would be waiting on its fence post anyway, and whether it would be confused when I didn't show up. The next day was clear and sunny, and sure enough there was my walking partner, sitting in its usual spot as if nothing had happened. When it saw me coming, its tail went up in what I'd learned was its version of a greeting, and we fell back into our familiar pattern. I started bringing small treats in my pocket, not to lure the cat closer, but just to leave on the bench when I finished my walk. Nothing fancy, just a few pieces of the dry cat food I'd bought at the grocery store. The cat would wait until I was completely gone before investigating the offering, maintaining its independence even while accepting the gesture. After 2 months of this daily routine, I've come to look forward to my feline escort more than I ever expected. There's something deeply peaceful about having this quiet, undemanding companionship on my walks. The cat asks for nothing except the pleasure of walking in the same direction, and somehow that feels like the purest kind of friendship. People in the neighbourhood have started referring to us as a pair. The mailman waves at both of us now, and the woman who runs the corner store always asks how my cat is doing, even though I keep explaining it's not technically my cat. But I've stopped correcting people as much, because in all the ways that matter, we are a team. Yesterday, for the first time, the cat came close enough that I could have reached out and touched it. It didn't ask for pets or try to rub against my legs, just sat near my bench and watched the ducks together with me. When I got up to leave, it maintained its usual distance, but I could swear there was something different in the way it looked at me, an acknowledgement of the bond we'd built through all those shared afternoons. That story comes to an end right there. Sometimes the best relationships are built on mutual respect and shared routines rather than constant interaction. This cat figured out the perfect formula for companionship: present but not demanding, loyal but not clingy. Speaking of unexpected sensory experiences, this next story takes us to a day when nature decided to perfume an entire neighbourhood. The day the air smelled like lilacs. I woke up that morning to something unusual, a sweet floral scent drifting through my bedroom window that was so strong I thought someone must be burning candles or incense nearby. But when I looked outside, there were no visible flowers in bloom anywhere on my street. It was early April, still too cold for most spring flowers, yet the entire neighbourhood smelled like we were surrounded by a massive lilac garden. I live on a pretty ordinary suburban street. Mostly small houses with modest front yards and a few mature trees, nothing particularly spectacular in terms of landscaping. Certainly nothing that would explain the incredible fragrance that seemed to be everywhere I went that morning. When I stepped outside to get my mail, the scent was even stronger. Not overwhelming, but present in a way that made me stop and breathe deeper, trying to figure out where it was coming from. I walked to the end of my driveway and looked up and down the street, expecting to see some enormous flowering tree or shrub that I'd somehow never noticed before. The neighbours across the street were in their front yard, and I called over to ask if they smelled it too. They both nodded enthusiastically, saying they'd been trying to solve the mystery since they'd had their coffee on the porch an hour earlier. None of us could identify a source for the lilac scent, but we all agreed it was the most pleasant mystery we'd encountered in years. As I walked to the corner store for groceries, the fragrance followed me down the entire length of the street and around the corner. Other people were clearly noticing it too. I saw a woman stop in the middle of the sidewalk, look around with a confused but delighted expression, then continue walking with a slight smile on her face. The store clerk mentioned it when I was checking out, saying customers had been commenting on the beautiful smell all morning, but no one could explain where it was coming from. She'd stepped outside several times to investigate, but the scent seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at once. On my walk home, I made a point of looking more carefully at every yard and garden space. There were a few small bushes that might have been lilacs, but none of them were in bloom yet. Most were just showing the first tiny green buds of early spring, weeks away from flowering. Yet the air remained thick with that distinctive, sweet fragrance that made every breath feel like a small gift. An elderly man walking his dog stopped to chat, and he told me he'd lived on this street for 35 years and had never experienced anything like it. He'd called his daughter, who lives 2 neighbourhoods over, and she said the air smelled completely normal where she was. Whatever was creating this pocket of floral perfume was localised to just our few blocks. By afternoon, the scent had intensified rather than fading. I spent an hour sitting on my front porch, trying to read but mostly just enjoying the unusual aromatherapy session that had somehow enveloped our entire street. Neighbours I barely knew were out in their yards, gardening or just standing around, and everyone seemed more relaxed and social than usual. Children playing in the park at the end of the street kept stopping their games to comment on how good everything smelled. One little girl announced to anyone who would listen that it smelled like princess air, which was probably the most accurate description anyone had come up with. The mystery continued into the evening. During dinner, I kept my windows open just to maintain that connection to the fragrant air outside. Even with cooking smells filling my kitchen, the lilac scent persisted, creating this layered olfactory experience that made ordinary Tuesday evening feel special. I never did figure out what caused that day of lilac-scented air. The next morning, the smell was gone as completely as it had appeared, leaving behind only the normal mix of car exhaust, cut grass, and whatever my neighbour was cooking for breakfast. But the memory of that inexplicable gift from nature has stayed with me. Sometimes I wonder if there was some meteorological explanation, maybe a wind pattern that carried the scent from a lilac farm miles away, or a thermal inversion that trapped floral molecules close to the ground. But honestly, I prefer the mystery. Some experiences are better left unexplained, filed away as evidence that the world still has the capacity to surprise us with unexpected beauty. That story ends there. Nature occasionally decides to gift us with experiences that defy explanation, and sometimes the best response is simply gratitude rather than investigation. An entire neighbourhood getting to live inside a lilac-scented cloud for one perfect day feels like something that should happen more often. Our next story brings us to a quiet discovery that speaks to the soul of every book lover. The bookstore with a sleeping cat in the window. I discovered Morrison's used books on a drizzly Saturday afternoon when I was killing time before a dinner reservation downtown. It was tucked between a vintage clothing shop and a small cafe, the kind of narrow storefront that's easy to miss if you're not paying attention. But what caught my eye wasn't the faded sign or the window display of weathered paperbacks. It was the cat, a large orange tabby, probably 8 or 9 pounds of pure contentment, curled up in the front window on top of a carefully arranged stack of hardcover novels. The cat was fast asleep, completely oblivious to the pedestrians passing by just inches away on the other side of the glass. Its fur was catching the warm light from the shop's interior, creating this perfect picture of peaceful domesticity framed by books. I stood on the sidewalk for several minutes, just watching this sleeping cat who had clearly found the most comfortable spot in the entire world. The stack of books beneath it looked sturdy enough to serve as a permanent bed, a mix of thick classics and modern bestsellers that created the perfect cat-sized platform in the sunny corner of the window. The bookstore itself looked exactly like what every book lover imagines when they dream of the perfect used bookstore. Floor-to-ceiling shelves packed with books of every size and colour, narrow aisles that invited wandering, and that particular smell of old paper and binding glue that means you found somewhere special. But the sleeping cat somehow made it all even more appealing, like a seal of approval from someone who clearly knew how to recognise comfort and quality. When I finally went inside, a small bell above the door announced my arrival, but the cat didn't even twitch. The store owner, a man probably in his 60s with reading glasses hanging from a chain around his neck, looked up from behind the counter and smiled. "Don't mind Oliver," he said, nodding toward the window. "He's our quality control supervisor. If the books aren't comfortable enough for him to sleep on, we don't sell them." I spent over an hour browsing through the shop, finding treasures in every section. A first edition mystery novel I'd been hunting for years, a poetry collection I'd never heard of, but fell in love with after reading the first few pages, and a cookbook from the 1940s with handwritten notes in the margins from some previous owner who clearly loved experimenting with new recipes. Every time I glanced toward the front window, Oliver was still there, still fast asleep, still perfectly positioned on his literary throne. Other customers would pause to look at him, and more than one person took photos of the sleeping cat surrounded by books. He was clearly a neighborhood celebrity, though he seemed completely unaware of his fame. The store owner told me Oliver had been coming to the shop for 4 years, ever since he was a kitten who wandered in one rainy afternoon and decided the bookstore was exactly where he belonged. "He's got excellent taste in literature," the man said with obvious affection. "He only sleeps on the good books. I've learned to trust his judgment about what belongs in the window display." I asked if Oliver belonged to the store, or if he lived somewhere else. "Oh, he's definitely our cat now," the owner replied, "but he comes and goes as he pleases. Some days he's here all day, greeting customers and supervising operations. Other days we don't see him at all. He's got his own schedule, and we just work around it." As I was paying for my books, I noticed that Oliver had shifted slightly in his sleep, now stretched out more fully across his stack of novels, with one paw dangling over the edge. The afternoon light had changed, but he'd somehow adjusted his position to stay in the warmest, brightest spot in the window. I've been back to Morrison's used books probably a dozen times since that first visit, and Oliver is almost always in his window spot. Though he's expanded his sleeping arrangements to include several different stacks of books, depending on the season and the angle of the sun, he's become part of my mental picture of the perfect bookstore, the living embodiment of what it means to be surrounded by stories and completely at peace with the world. The last time I visited, Oliver was awake and sitting upright in the window, watching the street with the alert but relaxed expression of someone who knows exactly where they belong. When he saw me approaching, I could swear he gave me a slow blink of recognition before settling back down into his favourite position among the books. That story reaches its conclusion there. There's something deeply satisfying about discovering a place where both books and cats are valued for their ability to create comfort and peace. Oliver has achieved what we all aspire to, finding the perfect spot where sunshine, literature, and contentment converge into one ideal afternoon. This next story takes us to a moment when the ordinary world transformed into something magical right under our feet, the rain that made the pavement sparkle. I was walking home from work on what had been a typical Thursday evening, the kind of grey, drizzly day that makes you want to get inside as quickly as possible. The rain had been light but persistent all afternoon, not heavy enough to require an umbrella but steady enough to make everything damp and slightly miserable. I'd just turned onto my street when the rain finally stopped, as suddenly as if someone had turned off a faucet in the sky. The clouds were still thick and grey overhead, but the droplets had simply ceased falling. What happened next turned an ordinary residential street into something that looked like it belonged in a fairy tale. The streetlights were just beginning to flicker on, even though it was only early evening, triggered by the heavy cloud cover that made it darker than usual. But instead of the normal pools of yellow light they usually cast on dry pavement, something extraordinary was happening. Every surface that had collected rainwater was reflecting the light back in the most beautiful way. The asphalt itself had become a mirror, not just the obvious puddles in potholes and low spots, but the entire length of the street was covered in a thin film of water that caught and held the streetlight like captured stars. Each light fixture created a perfect circle of reflection on the wet pavement, and walking down the sidewalk felt like stepping through a galaxy that had fallen to earth. But it wasn't just the streetlights creating this magic. Porch lights, the glow from windows, even the distant headlights of cars several blocks away, were all being reflected and multiplied by the wet surfaces. The whole neighborhood had transformed into this shimmering landscape where every source of light existed twice, once in the air and once captured in the water below. I stopped walking and just stood there, trying to take it all in. The reflection of the street lamp closest to me was so clear and bright that for a moment I couldn't tell which was the real light and which was the mirrored image. The rain had created a perfect reflecting surface, smooth and undisturbed, that doubled the illumination of the entire street. As I continued walking, I realized I wasn't the only one who had noticed the transformation. An elderly couple across the street had come out onto their porch and were pointing at the reflected lights, talking quietly to each other. A woman walking her dog had stopped completely, letting her pet sniff around while she stared at the sparkling pavement beneath her feet. The effect was even more dramatic, where the street curved slightly downhill. The reflected lights seemed to stretch out into the distance, creating these rivers of light that flowed along the contours of the road. It was like someone had scattered diamonds across the asphalt, each one catching and throwing back the warm glow of the neighborhood's evening lights. I found myself walking more slowly than usual, not wanting to disturb the perfect mirror surface of the street. My footsteps created small ripples in the thin layer of water, temporarily scattering the reflections before they reformed behind me. Even the sound was different, a softer splash than usual, as if the pavement was whispering back at each step. The trees lining the street added another layer to the magic. Their branches, heavy with raindrops, caught and reflected light from multiple sources, creating these intricate patterns of brightness against the dark sky. Every leaf that still held water became a tiny mirror, multiplying the streetlights into thousands of pinpricks of light scattered throughout the canopy above. By the time I reached my house, the temperature had dropped just enough that I could see my breath in the air, small puffs of vapor that seemed to glow softly in the reflected light from the wet pavement. The whole scene felt ethereal, temporary, like something that would disappear if I looked away for too long. I spent probably 20 minutes standing in my front yard, just watching the play of light and reflection that had transformed my ordinary street into something magical. Other neighbours had come outside too, drawn by the unusual beauty of their familiar surroundings, made new by nothing more than a thin layer of rainwater and the timing of the streetlights coming on. Within an hour, most of the water had evaporated or drained away, and the street returned to its normal appearance. But for that brief window of time, our entire neighbourhood had been turned into a wonderland of reflected light, a reminder that magic can appear anywhere when the conditions are just right. That story comes to an end there. Sometimes the most spectacular light shows happen right at our feet, created by nothing more than rain and timing, and the willingness to slow down long enough to notice. The fact that an entire neighbourhood got to share that moment of sparkling pavement makes it even more special. Our next story takes us out onto the water, where stillness became a form of meditation. The ferry that glided silently across the bay. I take the ferry to work twice a week, a 30-minute ride across the bay that's usually filled with commuters checking phones, reading newspapers, or grabbing coffee from the small galley on the lower deck. It's efficient transportation, nothing more, a way to avoid the bridge traffic that can add an hour to the drive during rush hour. But last Tuesday morning was different from the moment I stepped onto the boat. The bay was absolutely still, so calm that the water looked like polished glass stretching out in every direction. There wasn't even the slightest breeze, and the usual gentle rocking motion of the ferry was completely absent. We might as well have been gliding across a frozen lake. As we pulled away from the dock, I realised I couldn't hear the engines at all. Not because they weren't running, but because the usual sounds of water slapping against the hull, waves breaking around the bow, and the general churning noise of a boat moving through choppy water had completely disappeared. The ferry was moving through the still bay, almost silently, with just the faintest whisper of water parting around the hull. I went up to the upper deck to get a better view, and what I saw was unlike anything I'd experienced in 3 years of regular ferry rides. The water was so perfectly calm that the ferry's wake was the only disturbance visible anywhere on the bay. Behind us, two perfectly straight lines of small waves spread out in a V shape, the only evidence that we were moving at all. But even more remarkable was how clear the reflections were. The hills on the far side of the bay were mirrored so perfectly in the water that it was difficult to tell where the landscape ended and its reflection began. The morning sky, still painted with soft pastels from the sunrise, was duplicated below us in such detail that the ferry seemed to be sailing through the middle of a doubled world. Other passengers had noticed the unusual conditions too. People who normally spent the entire ride staring at their phones were standing at the rails, looking out at the impossibly smooth water. Conversations had dropped to whispers, as if speaking too loudly might somehow disturb the perfect stillness surrounding us. The silence was profound. Without the usual sound of waves and water movement, I could hear things that are normally masked by the noise of the boat's passage. Seabirds calling from a distance, the low hum of the engine from deep below, even conversations from other passengers that seemed to carry more clearly in the still air. About halfway across the bay, a small group of seals surfaced near the ferry, and their heads created the only other ripples visible on the entire expanse of water. They swam alongside us for a few minutes, and I could see their reflections as clearly as the seals themselves, creating this perfect symmetry of marine life above and below the surface. The captain made an announcement over the intercom that in 27 years of running this route, he'd never seen the bay this calm. He said we were experiencing what mariners call a perfect calm, when atmospheric pressure and wind patterns create conditions that turn large bodies of water into mirrors. He encouraged passengers to take a moment to appreciate how rare this was. As we approached the far dock, I found myself wishing the ride could continue indefinitely. There was something deeply meditative about gliding silently across perfectly still water, surrounded by doubled landscapes and reflected sky. The usual stress of commuting had been replaced by this sense of moving through a peaceful, dreamlike version of the familiar route. When the ferry finally nudged against the dock with the gentlest possible contact, it broke the spell. The normal sounds of ropes being secured and passengers preparing to disembark returned, and the workday began. But for 30 minutes, we'd all been part of something special. A journey across water so still, it seemed like we'd been transported to a different world entirely. I've taken that same ferry dozens of times since then, but the bay has never been quite as calm again. The water is usually choppy, the ride is bumpy, and the normal sounds of a boat moving through waves fill the air. But I find myself watching hopefully each time we pull away from the dock, wondering if I'll ever again experience that perfect silence of gliding across a bay turned to glass. But that story draws to a close there. There's something deeply moving about shared moments of natural perfection, especially when they happen during ordinary routines like commuting. That ferry ride became a meditation session for everyone on board, proving that transcendence can appear in the most unexpected places. Our next story brings us to a place that became someone's evening ritual, where consistency meets beauty in the most natural way. The bench that always faces the sunset. I discovered my favourite spot in the city completely by accident about 6 months ago. I was walking through Riverside Park after a particularly long day at the office, taking a route I'd never tried before, when I came across this simple wooden bench positioned on a small hill overlooking the river. What struck me immediately wasn't the bench itself, which was nothing special, just standard park furniture that had been weathered smooth by years of use. It was the way it was positioned, angled perfectly to face west toward the water, as if whoever had placed it there understood exactly what people would want to see when they sat down. I happened to arrive just as the sun was beginning its descent toward the horizon, painting the sky in those warm colours that make you stop whatever you're doing and just watch. From that bench, the view was unobstructed, a clear line of sight across the river to where the sun would eventually disappear behind the distant hills. I sat down, thinking I'd rest for just a few minutes before heading home, and ended up staying for over an hour. The sunset that evening was spectacular, but what made it even better was having the perfect vantage point to appreciate every minute of it. The bench was positioned at exactly the right height and angle to frame the entire show. As the weeks went by, I found myself timing my evening walks to arrive at the bench around the same time each day. Not because I was obsessive about routine, but because I'd discovered something that felt like a daily gift from the universe. Each sunset was different, but the bench was always there, always perfectly positioned to catch the best possible view. Other people had discovered the spot too, but there was an unspoken understanding among the regular visitors. We'd nod to each other in acknowledgement, share the space peacefully, and respect each other's need for quiet contemplation. Sometimes families would come with small children who would run around on the grass while parents watched the sky change colours. Other times I'd share the bench with elderly couples who held hands and watched the sun go down without saying much at all. The bench became my measuring stick for the changing seasons. In summer, the sun set far to the north, creating these long, dramatic shadows across the water. In winter, it dropped much further south, but the bare trees meant I could still see clearly from my spot. Spring and fall brought their own variations, different angles of light that transformed the same view into something new every few months. I started bringing a small thermos of coffee or tea, turning my sunset watching into a proper evening ritual. There was something deeply satisfying about settling onto that familiar bench with a warm drink, knowing I had the next hour free to do nothing but watch the sky perform its daily masterpiece. The best sunsets were the ones that came after stormy weather, when the clouds created dramatic backdrops for the setting sun. I'd watch the light filter through breaks in the storm clouds, sending shafts of golden light across the water and illuminating patches of landscape in the distance. Those were the evenings when other park visitors would stop their jogging or dog walking just to stand and stare at what was happening in the western sky. Even on cloudy days when there wasn't much of a visible sunset, I'd still find myself drawn to the bench. There was something comforting about the consistency of the spot, the way it remained perfectly positioned even when the weather didn't cooperate. On those grey evenings, I'd sit and watch the lights gradually fade from the sky, appreciating the quieter beauty of an overcast sunset. I've started thinking of that bench as my evening meditation spot, a place where the day's stress naturally falls away while I watch the sun complete its daily journey. There's something about facing west at the end of each day that feels symbolic, like I'm acknowledging the completion of another 24 hours while preparing for whatever comes next. The bench has become such an integral part of my routine that I feel slightly off balance on evenings when I can't make it there. It's not just about seeing the sunset anymore. It's about having that consistent moment of peace, that reliable reminder that beauty happens every single day if you know where to look for it. That story comes to an end there. Sometimes the perfect spot finds you rather than the other way around. The fact that someone positioned that bench with such perfect intention creates this daily gift for anyone who needs a front row seat to nature's most reliable show. Our next story takes us to a collection that captures not just objects, but entire moments preserved in miniature, the little jar of seashells. I've never been the type to collect things, but somehow, over the past few years, I've accumulated this small mason jar filled with seashells that sits on my bedroom windowsill. Each one represents a different beach, a different day, a different moment when I felt completely at peace with the world. It started during a weekend trip to the coast, about 3 years ago. I was walking along the shoreline early in the morning when the beach was empty except for a few joggers and people walking their dogs. The tide had gone out during the night, leaving behind this treasure trove of shells scattered across the wet sand. Most of them were ordinary, the kind of common shells you see on any beach, but there was one that caught my eye. a small spiral shell about the size of my thumbnail, perfectly intact and coloured in these subtle shades of pink and grey. I picked it up and rolled it around in my palm, feeling its smooth surface and delicate ridges. I almost put it back down, thinking it was silly to take home a random shell from a beach. But something about holding that small piece of the ocean made me want to keep it, to have a physical reminder of that peaceful morning walk. I slipped it into my pocket and forgot about it until I was unpacking my weekend bag at home. When I found the shell again, I put it in a small jar I had sitting empty on my dresser, thinking it would be a nice memento of the trip. I didn't plan for it to become the start of a collection, but somehow that's exactly what happened. The next shell came from a family reunion at a lake house the following summer. It wasn't technically a seashell, just a small freshwater mussel shell I found while walking along the lake shore with my nieces. But it went into the jar with the first one, because it carried the same kind of peaceful memory attached to it. Over the months and years that followed, the jar slowly filled with shells from different beaches and different experiences. A perfect sand dollar from a solo camping trip to the Oregon coast. A piece of sea glass that wasn't technically a shell, but felt like it belonged with the collection anyway. A tiny conch shell from a vacation in Florida that my sister and I found while looking for dolphin sightings. Each shell in the jar tells a story, not just about where I found it, but about what was happening in my life at that moment. The smooth white shell from the beach where I decided to quit my old job and take a chance on something new. The broken piece of abalone that still shimmers with rainbow colours from the weekend when I finally felt like I was healing from a difficult breakup. What I love most about the collection is how random and unplanned it is. I never go to beaches specifically looking for shells to add to my jar. They just appear when they're supposed to, usually when I'm walking slowly enough and paying enough attention to notice something beautiful lying in the sand. The jar itself has become a sort of meditation object. When I'm feeling stressed or overwhelmed, I'll take it down from the windowsill and pour the shells out onto my bed, examining each one and remembering the day I found it. The texture and weight of the shells in my hands brings back not just the visual memory of each beach, but the whole sensory experience of those peaceful moments. Some people might think it's strange to keep a jar of shells that aren't particularly rare or valuable, but to me they're priceless. They represent all the times I've been present enough to notice something small and beautiful, all the moments when I felt connected to the natural world in the most simple way possible. The jar isn't full yet, and I like knowing there's still room for more shells from future beaches and future moments of peace. Each time I travel somewhere near water, I find myself looking down at the shoreline, wondering what small treasure might be waiting to join the collection. Sometimes friends or family members offer to bring me shells from their own beach trips, but I always politely decline. The shells in my jar aren't just pretty objects, they're physical reminders of my own experiences, my own moments of stopping long enough to appreciate the small gifts that nature leaves scattered around for anyone willing to look. That story reaches its conclusion right there. There's something deeply satisfying about a collection that grows organically from lived experiences rather than deliberate hunting. Each shell becomes a tiny time machine, carrying the essence of peaceful moments back to an ordinary bedroom windowsill. Our next story brings us to one of those perfect afternoon discoveries, where the simplest pleasure becomes the most restorative. The sleepy afternoon nap on the porch swing. I inherited the porch swing from my grandmother when I moved into her old house last spring. It had been hanging in the same spot for probably 20 years, weathered but sturdy, with chains that creaked gently whenever a breeze moved it back and forth. At first I thought about replacing it with something more modern, maybe some sleek outdoor furniture that would look better with the improvements I was planning for the rest of the house. But every time I sat on that swing for a few minutes while having my morning coffee, I found myself reluctant to give it up. The swing was positioned perfectly on the front porch, facing east so it caught the morning sun, but stayed shaded during the hot afternoon hours. The old cushions were faded but still comfortable, worn soft by decades of use. When you sat down, the swing found its natural rhythm almost immediately, a gentle rocking motion that seemed designed to slow down whatever thoughts were racing through your head. One particularly warm Saturday afternoon in late summer, I'd been working in the garden for most of the day, pulling weeds and trying to restore the flower beds that had been neglected for a few years. By 3 o'clock, I was exhausted and sweaty, ready for a break but not quite ready to go inside where the air conditioning would shock my overheated system. I collapsed onto the porch swing with a tall glass of iced tea, thinking I'd rest for maybe 10 minutes before getting back to work. The afternoon was perfectly quiet except for the sound of cicadas humming in the big oak tree that shaded most of the front yard. A gentle breeze was moving through the neighbourhood, just strong enough to keep the swing swaying slightly even when I wasn't pushing it with my feet. Within minutes, I felt my eyelids getting heavy. The combination of physical tiredness from gardening, the rhythmic motion of the swing, and the drowsy sound of the cicadas created this perfect storm of sleepiness. I told myself I'd just close my eyes for a moment, just long enough to rest them from the bright afternoon sun. When I woke up, the light had changed completely. The harsh brightness of midday had been replaced by the softer, golden light of early evening. I'd been asleep for over 2 hours, curled up on my side with my head resting on the swing's armrest. The glass of iced tea was still balanced carefully in my hand, though the ice had long since melted. What struck me most was how incredibly rested I felt, not groggy or disoriented like I usually am after unexpected naps, but refreshed and peaceful in a way that seemed to reach down to my bones. The swing was still moving slightly in the evening breeze, and I could hear the sounds of dinner being prepared in houses around the neighbourhood, children playing in distant backyards, dogs barking their hellos to owners coming home from work. I stayed on the swing for another hour as the sun continued to set, not because I was still tired, but because the spot felt so perfectly comfortable and peaceful. Neighbours walking by would wave and call out friendly greetings, and I'd wave back from my perch on the swing, feeling like I was part of the gentle rhythm of the neighbourhood's evening routine. Since that afternoon, the porch swing has become my favourite place for weekend naps. There's something about sleeping outside, protected by the porch roof, but still connected to the sounds and smells of the natural world, that creates deeper rest than I ever get indoors. The gentle motion of the swing seems to rock away not just physical tiredness, but mental stress as well. I've learned to time these swing naps perfectly, settling in during the early afternoon, when the porch is shaded, but the air is still warm. I'll bring a light blanket if there's a breeze, and sometimes a book that I rarely end up opening. The combination of fresh air, gentle motion, and the peaceful sounds of the neighbourhood almost guarantees that I'll drift off within minutes. The swing has taught me something about the value of unplanned rest, of giving in to tiredness when your body asks for it, instead of pushing through with caffeine and determination. Those spontaneous naps have become some of my most treasured quiet moments, little pockets of peace that restore me in ways that planned relaxation never quite manages to achieve. That story comes to an end right there. Sometimes the best sleep happens when we're not trying to sleep at all, just letting ourselves be lulled by gentle motion and the peaceful sounds of an ordinary afternoon. That porch swing became a portal to the kind of rest that heals both body and spirit. Our final story tonight takes us to one of those rare celestial moments that make you feel connected to something much larger than yourself. The time the moon looked close enough to touch. I've always been someone who notices the moon, but last October I witnessed something that made me understand why ancient cultures built entire mythologies around lunar cycles. It was one of those autumn evenings when the air was crisp and clear, perfect for seeing details in the night sky that usually get lost in atmospheric haze. I was walking home from dinner with friends around 10:30, taking my usual route through the quiet residential streets near my apartment. The evening had been pleasant but unremarkable. Just good food and easy conversation. Nothing that prepared me for what I was about to see when I turned the corner onto my street. The moon was hanging just above the roofline of the houses across from mine, so large and bright that it looked like a spotlight had been positioned just behind the trees. But it wasn't just the size that was remarkable, it was the clarity. I could see every crater, every shadow, every detail of the lunar surface with startling definition, as if I was looking at it through a telescope instead of just with my naked eyes. The moon appeared to be resting right on the horizon, close enough that it felt like I could walk to the end of the street and reach up to touch it. The optical illusion was so convincing that I actually stopped walking and stared, trying to process what I was seeing. The rational part of my brain knew the moon was still 240,000 miles away, but my eyes were telling me something completely different. The colour was unlike any moon I'd ever seen before. Not the pale white or yellow we usually associate with moonlight, but this rich, warm orange gold that looked like it was lit from within. The surface details were so sharp and clear that I could make out individual mountain ranges and crater walls, features that are usually just vague shadows when viewed from Earth. I stood on the sidewalk for probably 20 minutes, just staring up at this impossibly close and detailed moon. Other people in the neighbourhood had noticed it too. Porch lights were coming on as residents stepped outside to get a better look. I could hear conversations from nearby yards, people calling to family members to come see what was happening in the sky. A couple walking their dog stopped beside me, and we ended up having a quiet conversation about whether we'd ever seen anything like it before. None of us had. The woman mentioned that her grandmother used to call nights like this moon-touched, when the lunar presence felt so strong it seemed to have physical weight in the air around us. The longer I watched, the more I felt like I was witnessing something sacred. The moon seemed to pulse gently with its own inner light, and the orange glow was so warm and inviting that it felt more like sunrise than the middle of the night. The usual cold, distant quality of moonlight had been replaced by something that felt almost alive, almost aware of being observed. Even the shadows cast by the moonlight were different that night. Instead of the sharp, stark shadows we usually get from overhead lighting, everything was bathed in this soft golden glow that made familiar objects look magical. Trees, houses, parked cars, everything looked like it had been painted with warm honey instead of illuminated by reflected sunlight. I found myself reluctant to go inside, afraid that if I looked away for too long, the spell would be broken and the moon would return to its normal size and distance. But when I finally forced myself to unlock my front door and go to bed, I kept checking out my bedroom window to make sure the extraordinary moon was still there. By morning, of course, the moon had set and the memory almost felt like a dream. But I knew it had been real because other people in the neighbourhood mentioned it over the next few days, sharing their own amazement at what we'd all witnessed together. Someone at the coffee shop said their 5-year-old daughter had woken them up because she thought the moon was falling out of the sky. I've watched the moon more carefully since that night, hoping to catch another one of those rare moments when atmospheric conditions and orbital mechanics combine to create something truly spectacular. The moon is beautiful every night, but there was something about that particular evening that felt like a gift, a reminder of how much wonder exists in the natural world for anyone who takes the time to look up. That story draws to a close right there. Some nights the universe decides to show off, creating moments so perfect they feel almost impossible to believe. That moon became a neighbourhood event, reminding everyone who saw it that we're all sharing this one small planet under the same extraordinary sky. These gentle stories remind us that magic isn't always dramatic or life-changing. Sometimes it's as simple as finding the perfect bench, or watching clouds reshape themselves, or discovering that the air can smell like flowers for no reason at all. Tonight's collection has been about those quiet moments that restore our faith in the everyday beauty that surrounds us, the kind of experiences that make ordinary days feel touched by something wonderful. Whether you found your own hidden meadow in these stories, or recognized the peaceful rhythm of rain on windows, or felt the contentment of a cat who knows exactly where it belongs. I hope these tales have given you the same gentle exhale they gave me. Sometimes the best stories aren't about grand adventures or dramatic changes, but about the simple act of paying attention to the world around us and discovering that it's already full of small miracles waiting to be noticed. I think there's something deeply human about our need for those small escapes, those moments when the ordinary world reveals its hidden layers of beauty. Maybe that's why we're drawn to places like quiet meadows or peaceful train rides, or why we find such comfort in the gentle rhythm of a porch swing on a sleepy afternoon. These next stories come from people who discovered that magic doesn't always announce itself with fireworks and fanfare. Sometimes it whispers through the space between raindrops, or glows softly in the window of an old bookstore, or drifts along a river like fallen stars. These are the kinds of moments that remind us to slow down, to breathe deeply, and to notice that wonder is everywhere if we just know how to look. So settle in a little deeper. Let these gentle tales wash over you like warm rain on a quiet evening. These are stories about finding peace in unexpected places, about the beauty that exists in the margins of our busy lives, and about those perfect moments when everything feels exactly as it should be. The hidden trail with wildflowers. I've been walking the same route to work for 3 years now, past the same coffee shop, the same crosswalk, the same row of oak trees that line Maple Street. You'd think after 1,000 trips down the same sidewalk, I'd know every crack in the pavement, every building, every detail, but apparently I'd been missing something extraordinary hiding in plain sight. Last Tuesday morning, I was running about 10 minutes late, which meant I was walking faster than usual and probably paying less attention to my surroundings. But something made me glance to my left as I passed the spot where 2 massive oak trees grow close together near the old brick church. There was this narrow gap between their trunks that I'd somehow never noticed before, maybe 2 feet wide, just big enough for a person to squeeze through sideways. I almost kept walking, because being late to the quarterly budget meeting wasn't really optional. But curiosity got the better of me, and I found myself stepping off the sidewalk and approaching the gap between the trees. From the street, it looked like it might just lead to the back of the church property, maybe a maintenance area or a dead end behind some building. I turned sideways and squeezed through the gap, branches catching slightly on my jacket. What I found on the other side stopped me completely in my tracks. The narrow space opened up into this hidden meadow that couldn't have been more than half an acre, completely enclosed by mature trees and invisible from any road or building, but the size wasn't what took my breath away. The entire space was filled with wildflowers, not planted in neat garden rows, but growing in natural drifts and clusters, like nature had been painting with colour for years without anyone watching. There were tall purple lupines swaying near the back edge, bright orange California poppies scattered throughout the grass, and delicate white flowers I couldn't identify that seemed to glow in the dappled morning light, filtering through the canopy above. The air inside the meadow smelled sweet and green, with that particular scent that comes from flowers warming in the early sun. I could hear bees moving lazily from bloom to bloom, and birds calling from somewhere deeper in the surrounding trees. The ground was soft underfoot, carpeted with fallen petals, and new grass that felt springy beneath my work shoes. I stood there for what felt like an hour, but was probably only 5 minutes, just taking in this secret garden that had been hiding 20 feet from a busy sidewalk. The flowers moved gently in a breeze I could barely feel, creating subtle waves of colour across the meadow. It felt like stumbling into a fairy tale, like finding Narnia behind the wardrobe. When I finally made myself leave, I was 15 minutes late to the meeting, but I couldn't bring myself to care. I carefully noted the exact position of the oak trees, the angle of approach, every detail that would help me find this place again. I was terrified it might somehow disappear, that it might have been some kind of morning light illusion that wouldn't be there the next day. But it was real, and it's still there. I've been back dozens of times now, in different seasons and different weather. In late summer, the flower varieties changed completely, new species appearing as others faded. In autumn, the meadow filled with golden grasses and the last brave blooms of the year. Even in winter, it was beautiful in its own stark way, peaceful and quiet with frost coating the dried stems. I've never encountered another person in the meadow. No footprints, no litter, no signs that anyone else knows about this pocket of wilderness hiding in the middle of the city. Sometimes, I wonder if I should tell someone about it, share the discovery with friends or family. But mostly, I just feel grateful that it exists, that there are still secret places in the world waiting to be found by accident on an ordinary Tuesday morning. The meadow has become my reset button. When work stress gets overwhelming or life feels too complicated, I slip through that gap between the oak trees and sit among the wildflowers for a few minutes. Problems that seemed impossible start to feel manageable again. It's like the flowers know something about taking life one day at a time, one season at a time, that the rest of us have forgotten. That story comes to an end right there. The idea that someone could walk past their own secret garden for 3 years before finally noticing it feels like the perfect metaphor for how much beauty we miss when we're too busy to really see what's around us. Sometimes the most magical discoveries are hiding behind the most ordinary facades, waiting for the exact moment we're ready to squeeze through that narrow gap and find what's been there all along. Speaking of unexpected journeys, this next story takes us aboard a train where the weather became the main attraction instead of just something to endure. The train ride where it rained the whole way. I'm usually someone who checks the weather obsessively before travelling, packing umbrellas and rain jackets, and generally preparing for the worst case scenario. So when I boarded the morning train from Portland to Seattle and saw the thick grey clouds gathering outside the windows, I settled in with my noise-cancelling headphones and a downloaded movie, ready to ignore what looked like it was going to be a dreary, wet journey. The rain started just as we pulled away from Union Station, light drops speckling the windows as the city gave way to suburbs and then countryside. I had my laptop out, planning to catch up on work emails during the 4-hour ride, but something about the rhythm of the raindrops against the glass made me close the computer and just watch instead. At first it was ordinary Pacific Northwest rain, steady but unremarkable. But as we moved north through Oregon and into Washington, the rainfall became more purposeful, more present. The drops weren't just hitting the windows randomly anymore. They were racing each other down the glass in perfect little streams, constantly merging and separating as the train swayed gently on the tracks. I found myself following individual droplets with my eyes, picking one near the top of my window and watching it gather other drops as it traced its way down. Some would make it all the way to the bottom in one continuous journey, while others would get caught in the train's vibration and scatter into smaller streams. It was like watching tiny liquid marathons, each droplet with its own story of momentum and gravity and chance. The landscape outside became dreamlike through the rain-streaked glass. Forests appeared and disappeared in soft focus, their edges blurred and mysterious. Rivers seemed to multiply, reflecting the grey sky in silver ribbons that wound between hills I could barely make out through the downpour. Even the small towns we passed through looked different, softer somehow, like watercolour paintings left out in the rain. The sound was hypnotic, not just the rain on the windows, but the way it mixed with the steady rhythm of the train on the tracks. It created this layered, almost musical backdrop that seemed to slow time itself. Conversations throughout the car became quieter, more intimate. People put away their phones and laptops, settling back in their seats with the same drowsy contentment I was feeling. About halfway through the journey, the rain intensified into what felt like a proper deluge. The world outside the windows became completely abstract, just moving shapes and colours behind a curtain of water. But instead of feeling claustrophobic or trapped, there was something deeply comforting about being warm and dry inside our moving shelter while nature put on its show around us. I noticed other passengers relaxing in the same way, A businessman across the aisle closed his laptop and stared out the window with a peaceful expression. A young mother let her toddler press his face against the glass to watch the racing raindrops, and they both got quiet and mesmerized by the patterns. An elderly couple shared a thermos of coffee and pointed out shapes they imagined seeing in the blurred landscape, laughing softly at their own discoveries. The train seemed to be moving more slowly than usual, though I couldn't tell if that was actually true or if the rain just made everything feel more leisurely. Time stretched out in the most pleasant way, like we were all suspended in this cocoon of gentle motion and steady rainfall, completely separate from whatever was happening in the rest of the world. When we finally pulled into Seattle's King Street station, I felt genuinely disappointed that the journey was over. The rain was still coming down steadily, and I sat in my seat for an extra few minutes, listening to it drum against the roof and watching the last few drops race down my window. Other passengers were gathering their bags and preparing to rush out into the weather, but I wanted to hold on to that peaceful, suspended feeling for just a little longer. I ended up being 20 minutes late to my meeting because I took my time walking from the station, letting the rain soak through my jacket while I tried to carry that train car, Serenity, with me into the busy afternoon ahead. Even now, whenever I hear rain against windows, I'm transported back to that slow, gentle journey where the weather became the best part of the trip. That story ends there. There's something magical about surrendering to circumstances beyond our control and discovering they were exactly what we needed. That train ride became a moving meditation session, proving that sometimes the most memorable journeys happen when we stop trying to fight the elements and start appreciating them instead. Our next story comes from someone who discovered that the most faithful friends sometimes have 4 legs and unlimited patience for human schedules. The old dog that always waits by the bakery. My morning routine takes me down Elm Street every weekday, past the same row of shops and cafes I've been seeing for 2 years since I moved to this neighbourhood. It's a pleasant enough walk to the office, tree-lined and quiet, but it had become so automatic that I barely noticed my surroundings anymore. That changed about 8 months ago when I started really paying attention to one particular resident of the street. Outside Morning Glory Bakery, about halfway through my route, there's this golden retriever who positions himself beside the front door every single morning. He's clearly an older dog, probably 9 or 10 years old, with a greying muzzle and that kind of patient, wise expression that comes with age. His coat is still beautiful, thick and lustrous, though not quite as golden as it probably once was. At first I assumed he belonged to whoever owned the bakery, just a shop dog keeping watch over the business. But as I started paying closer attention during my daily walks, I realised something wonderful was happening that had nothing to do with guarding property. This dog wasn't there to protect anything. He was there to greet everyone who passed by, and he took this job very seriously. Every person who walked down that sidewalk, whether they were customers heading into the bakery or just commuters like me passing through on their way to work, received the same enthusiastic welcome. His tail would start wagging the moment he spotted someone approaching from either direction, and it would continue wagging steadily until they were completely out of sight down the street. It wasn't the frantic, overexcited wagging of a young dog, but the steady, happy rhythm of someone who was genuinely pleased to see each person who crossed his path. If people stopped to pet him, which many did, he would lean into their touch with obvious appreciation, his eyes closing slightly in contentment. But he never begged for attention or followed people when they continued on their way. He just offered his greeting freely and then settled back into position to wait for the next person. I started making a point of stopping to say good morning to him, and he quickly learned to recognise me from a block away. His tail would speed up a little when he saw me coming, and he'd stand up to properly receive his daily pets. I began carrying small dog treats in my pocket, though I checked with the bakery staff first to make sure it was okay to give him food. The woman behind the counter told me his name was Charlie, and that he'd been showing up every morning for over 3 years. He didn't belong to the bakery, but to an elderly man named Frank, who lived in the apartment building next door. Frank had started bringing Charlie with him on morning walks to get coffee and a pastry, and Charlie had apparently decided that greeting the neighbourhood was his personal mission. Even on days when Frank wasn't feeling well enough for their walk, Charlie would find his way to his post by the bakery door. Frank would watch from his second-floor window, the woman told me, making sure his dog was safe while allowing him to continue his self-appointed job as the neighbourhood's official greeter. What struck me most was how Charlie seemed to sense what each person needed from him. With hurried commuters like myself, he offered a quick but warm greeting, a moment of connection that didn't delay our schedules. With people who seemed to have more time, like retirees out for morning walks or parents with strollers, he was more interactive, clearly enjoying longer conversations and extended petting sessions. Children were his specialty. I watched him automatically lower himself to the ground when small kids approached, making himself less intimidating, while his tail continued its steady, welcoming beat. He had infinite patience for tiny hands, pulling gently on his ears, or toddlers who wanted to hug him around the neck. On rainy days, Charlie would position himself under the small awning that extended over the bakery's entrance, but he never abandoned his post completely. Even in the worst weather, he'd find a way to offer his greetings while staying reasonably dry, committed to his daily mission regardless of conditions. I realised that Charlie had become an anchor point in my day, a constant that made the whole neighbourhood feel more like home and less like just a place I happened to work near. Seeing his patient, friendly face every morning started each day with a small dose of uncomplicated joy, a reminder that some creatures in this world show up consistently with nothing but kindness to offer. That story comes to an end there. Charlie represents everything we love about dogs and everything we could learn from them about showing up every day with pure, uncomplicated goodness. His daily presence transformed an ordinary street corner into a place where community happens naturally, one tail wag at a time. Dogs have this incredible ability to make us feel seen and welcomed, even when we're just strangers passing by on our way to somewhere else. Speaking of finding peace in simple observation, this next story takes us to one of those perfect afternoons when the sky becomes entertainment enough and time seems to slow down to match the gentle pace of drifting clouds. The afternoon I watched clouds drift for hours. I'm not usually the type to just lie around doing nothing productive, but last summer I found myself with an unexpectedly free Saturday afternoon when all my plans fell through at the last minute. Instead of scrambling to fill the time with activities or catch up on household chores, I decided to embrace the emptiness of the day and see what happened. I grabbed an old quilt from the hall closet and walked to the small park behind my apartment complex. It's nothing fancy, just a patch of grass with a few mature oak trees and a playground that's usually busy with families on weekends. But that particular afternoon it was completely empty, peaceful in the way that only happens when you're not expecting it. I spread the quilt under one of the larger trees, positioned so I had a clear view of the sky, but still had some shade from the branches above. The grass was soft and recently mowed, and there was just enough breeze to keep the temperature perfect for lying outside. I settled back and looked up, and that's when I really noticed what was happening in the sky above me. The clouds were putting on a show. They weren't the flat, boring grey clouds that just sit there looking heavy and threatening, or the thin, wispy ones that barely register as weather. These were the good clouds, the kind that looked like they were painted by someone who understood how to make the sky interesting. Puffy white formations that cast shadows as they moved, creating a constantly changing pattern of light and dark across the landscape below. I started following individual clouds as they drifted across my field of vision, and I realised I hadn't really looked at clouds, really looked at them, since I was probably 8 years old. These weren't just random puffs of water vapour drifting aimlessly. They had personalities, stories written in their shapes that changed and evolved as I watched. One cluster looked exactly like a dragon, complete with wings spread wide and a long tail trailing behind. I watched it slowly transform as it moved, the wind pulling at its edges until the dragon became something else entirely, maybe a sailing ship with billowing sails. Then the ship dissolved into wisps that reformed into what could have been a sleeping cat, curled up with its tail wrapped around its body. The longer I watched, the more I started to see. There were castles with towers that crumbled and rebuilt themselves, faces that appeared and disappeared within minutes, animals that morphed into other animals as they crossed the blue canvas above me. It was like having access to the world's most creative art gallery, one where the exhibits changed every few minutes, and admission was completely free. What surprised me was how meditative the whole experience became. Following the slow drift of the clouds required just enough focus to quiet the usual chatter in my head, but not so much concentration that it felt like work. My breathing slowed to match the lazy pace of the afternoon, and I felt tension I didn't even know I'd been carrying start to melt away into the warm grass beneath me. Time became completely irrelevant. I had no idea if I'd been lying there for 30 minutes or 3 hours. The sun moved across the sky, changing the angle of light and creating new shadows, but the clouds kept their steady procession overhead, an endless parade of shapes and possibilities that required nothing from me except the willingness to watch and imagine. A family with young children eventually arrived at the playground, and I could hear their voices and laughter mixing with the sound of swings creaking and sneakers on metal slides. But even those sounds felt peaceful, like they belonged to the lazy rhythm of the afternoon. The children's joy added to the contentment rather than breaking the spell. I think I dozed off at some point because I remember waking to find the light had changed to that golden quality that comes in the late afternoon. The clouds had shifted positions and taken on warmer colours as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. What had been bright white earlier was now touched with pink and orange around the edges, like someone had started adding sunset colours to the sky's palette. When I finally rolled up my quilt and headed home, I felt like I'd been on vacation without leaving my neighbourhood. My shoulders were relaxed, my mind was clear, and I had that peaceful tiredness that comes from a day well spent doing absolutely nothing that could be measured or quantified. That afternoon taught me something valuable about the importance of unstructured time, about what happens when you give yourself permission to just be present without an agenda. The clouds had been putting on that same show every day, but I'd been too busy to notice. Now I try to make time for more sky-watching afternoons, though none have been quite as perfect as that first accidental discovery. That story ends there. Sometimes the best entertainment doesn't require a screen or a subscription, just a willingness to lie back and let your imagination run wild with whatever nature provides. The fact that this person stumbled into hours of pure contentment just by looking up reminds us how much wonder we miss when we're always looking down at our phones or rushing from one task to the next. This next story brings us to a simple beverage that transformed an ordinary evening into something that felt touched by magic, proving that sometimes the smallest pleasures can shift our entire experience of the world. Our next story comes from someone who discovered something magical during a late-night walk. This happened about 2 months ago, and I still think about it almost every day. I live in a small town in Oregon, and there's this lake about 15 minutes from my house that I've been visiting since I was a kid. Usually, I go during the day for hiking or fishing, but that particular night, I couldn't sleep and decided to take a drive. It was around 2 out in the morning when I pulled up to the empty parking area. The lake sits in this natural bowl surrounded by hills, and there's a small dock that extends maybe 20 feet into the water. I wasn't planning to stay long, just wanted some fresh air to clear my head. As I walked toward the water, I noticed something that made me stop completely. The surface was so perfectly still that it looked like glass, not a single ripple anywhere, and the sky above was absolutely clear, filled with more stars than I'd ever seen from this spot. But here's the thing that took my breath away. When I looked down at the water, it was like looking at a perfect mirror. Every single star was reflected so clearly that I couldn't tell where the real sky ended and the reflection began. The Milky Way stretched across both the actual heavens and its twin below. It was like standing between two infinite universes. I sat on the edge of the dock and just stared. For maybe an hour, I couldn't move. The water was so still that even my breathing didn't seem to disturb the surface. Occasionally, a gentle breeze would move through the trees on the hills, but somehow it never touched the water itself. The strangest part was how quiet everything became, not just around me, but inside my head too. All the stress from work, all the things I'd been worrying about, they just seemed to fade away. It was like the universe was showing me this perfect moment of symmetry and peace. I've been back to that lake probably 10 times since then, but I've never seen it quite like that again. The water is usually moving slightly, or there are clouds, or the timing just isn't right. But that one night, everything aligned perfectly. I took a few photos, but they don't capture what it actually felt like to be there. It was one of those experiences that exists more in feeling than in image. Like the lake was holding up a mirror to infinity itself. When I finally drove home around 3:30, I slept better than I had in months. Sometimes I think that lake knew exactly what I needed that night. That story is over. There's something magical about those moments when nature creates perfect symmetry like that. It's like the universe occasionally decides to show off its artistic skills, just for the few people lucky enough to witness it. The fact that it happened during a sleepless night makes it even more special. This next story takes us to a completely different kind of peaceful moment, one that happened during the middle of a busy afternoon. I work from home as a freelance graphic designer, and my schedule can get pretty chaotic. Some days I'm jumping between 3 different projects, dealing with client revisions, and trying to meet impossible deadlines. Last Thursday was one of those days where everything seemed to be going wrong at once. My computer crashed twice, losing about an hour of work each time. A client called to completely change the direction of a project I'd been working on for weeks. My internet kept cutting out right in the middle of important video calls. By 2 hours in the afternoon, I was completely frazzled. I decided I needed a break before I completely lost my mind. Instead of scrolling through my phone or grabbing another cup of coffee, I walked outside to my backyard. There's this old oak tree that's probably been there for 50 years, with branches that spread out like a natural umbrella. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, not too cold, with this gentle breeze that made all the leaves whisper together. I grabbed a small pillow from my patio furniture and lay down directly under the tree, looking up through the branches at the sky. The sunlight was filtering through the leaves in this incredible way. It wasn't harsh or blinding, just these soft patches of gold that moved and danced as the branches swayed. Every few seconds, the pattern would shift completely, creating new shapes and shadows on my face. I could hear the leaves rustling above me, this constant, gentle sound that was somehow both consistent and ever-changing. It reminded me of white noise, but organic and alive. Cars were driving by on the street, but they seemed so distant and unimportant compared to this natural symphony happening right above me. What started as a quick 5-minute break turned into almost an hour. I wasn't sleeping exactly, but I wasn't fully awake either, just existing in this space between the earth and sky, watching the light show that the tree was putting on for free. My phone was buzzing with notifications from my pocket, but for the first time in weeks, I didn't care. The urgent emails and client messages could wait. This moment belonged to me and this tree and the dance of light and shadow happening between us. When I finally went back inside, I felt completely reset. My perspective had shifted somehow. The same problems that had seemed overwhelming an hour earlier now felt manageable. The crashed files were still crashed. The difficult client was still difficult, but I had this sense of calm that carried me through the rest of the day. I've started making this a regular thing. Every afternoon around 2 I take my pillow outside and spend at least 20 minutes under that oak tree. It's become my favourite part of working from home. That story is over. Sometimes the best therapy is free and growing right in your backyard. There's something about lying under a tree that connects us to something bigger than our daily stress. Nature has this incredible way of putting things into perspective without us even realizing it's happening. Our next story comes from someone who witnessed one of nature's most beautiful surprises right after thinking their day was ruined. This happened about 3 weeks ago, during what started as the worst possible timing for a storm. I had planned this elaborate outdoor barbecue for my birthday. We're talking weeks of preparation, invitations sent out to 30 people, a whole menu planned around grilling, lawn games set up in my backyard, the works. The weather forecast had been calling for clear skies all week, so I felt confident about hosting everything outside. My friends started arriving around 3 in the afternoon, and everything was going perfectly. The food was turning out great, people were laughing and having fun, and I was thinking this might be one of the best birthdays I'd ever had. Then around 4:30, these dark clouds started rolling in from nowhere. I'm talking about clouds so thick and black, they made the afternoon look like evening. The wind picked up dramatically, and you could smell rain in the air from miles away. Within 15 minutes, we went from perfect party weather to the kind of storm that makes you want to run for cover. The rain didn't just start, it attacked, heavy, driving sheets of water that soaked through everything in seconds. The wind was strong enough to blow over my patio furniture. Everyone scrambled into my house, dripping wet and laughing about the sudden change. We managed to save most of the food, but the outdoor party vibe was completely destroyed. I was trying to hide my disappointment, but inside I felt like the day had been ruined. The storm lasted for about 45 minutes of intense rain and thunder. We made the best of it inside, but I kept looking out the windows, feeling frustrated about all the planning that had gone to waste. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the storm stopped. The rain just cut off like someone had turned off a faucet. The clouds began to break apart, and late afternoon sunlight started streaming through the gaps. My friend Alex was the first one to notice it. She was looking out my living room window and suddenly gasped and pointed outside. "Oh my God, you guys have to see this," she said. We all crowded around the windows and sliding doors to look out into my backyard. Stretching across the entire sky, from one side of the horizon to the other, was the most perfect rainbow I've ever seen in my life. It wasn't just visible, it was vibrant. Every colour was distinct and bright, from the deep red at the outer edge to the purple on the inside. But what made it even more incredible was that you could see the complete arc. Usually, you only see part of a rainbow, but this one went all the way across the sky in a perfect semicircle. And then, as we were all standing there amazed, a second rainbow appeared above the first one, fainter, but definitely there, with the colours reversed. A double rainbow stretching across my entire neighbourhood, like nature's apology for ruining my barbecue. Everyone rushed outside to get a better look. We stood in my soggy backyard, still dripping from the storm, staring up at this incredible display. People were taking photos, but mostly we just stood there in awe. The rainbow lasted for maybe 20 minutes, before slowly fading as the sun moved lower in the sky. But those 20 minutes transformed the entire day. What had felt like a disaster became the most memorable birthday I've ever had. People are still talking about it weeks later. Instead of remembering the party that got rained out, they remember the birthday where we saw the most amazing rainbow together. Sometimes the universe has better plans than we do. That story is over. It's funny how nature sometimes ruins our plans only to replace them with something infinitely better. A rainbow like that probably created a more lasting memory than any perfectly executed barbecue ever could. Sometimes the best moments are the ones we never could have planned. Let's move to something completely different. A story about finding comfort in the smallest, simplest pleasure on a cold morning. I live in Minnesota, so our winters are no joke. We're talking about months where the temperature doesn't get above freezing, where your car won't start some mornings, where you have to layer 3 different coats just to walk to the mailbox. By February, everyone here develops this kind of winter madness, where you start questioning why humans ever decided to live in places this cold. This particular morning was brutal, even by Minnesota standards. The thermometer on my porch read -18 degrees, not counting wind chill. There was frost on the inside of my windows, which is always a bad sign. My heating bill was going to be astronomical, but I had the heat cranked up anyway, because some things are worth the money. I had to be at work by 8:30, which meant leaving the house at 7:30 to give my car time to warm up. But first I needed something to make facing that cold seem possible. Coffee wasn't going to cut it. I needed something more comforting, more ritualistic. I decided to make tea, which isn't something I do very often. I'm usually a coffee person, but something about the morning called for tea. I found a box of chamomile and honey blend that someone had given me months ago, and I'd never opened. I filled my electric kettle with water and set it to boil while I found my favourite mug. It's this oversized ceramic one that my sister gave me for Christmas, painted with little blue flowers, big enough that you have to hold it with both hands. While I waited for the water, I stood at my kitchen window, looking out at the winter landscape. Everything was covered in this thick layer of frost that made the whole world look like it was made of crystal. The bare tree branches looked like they'd been dipped in silver. Even the power lines had this delicate coating of ice that caught the early morning light. When the kettle clicked off, I poured the steaming water over the tea bag and watched the colour slowly spread through the water. The steam rose up from the mug in these perfect spirals, and I could already smell the chamomile and honey mixing together. I wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic and brought the mug close to my face. The steam hit my cheeks and nose, creating this little pocket of warmth and humidity in the dry winter air. It was like having a tiny personal sauna right there in my kitchen. The first sip was perfect. Not too hot to burn my tongue, but warm enough that I could feel it spreading through my chest and stomach. The honey added just the right amount of sweetness, and the chamomile had this gentle floral taste that seemed to calm everything inside me. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just holding that mug and watching the frost sparkle on my windows. The tea was warming me from the inside while the mug warmed my hands. Even though I knew I'd have to face the brutal cold in a few minutes, for that moment I felt completely cozy and protected. When I finally had to leave for work, the cold didn't seem quite as harsh. Maybe it was the warmth I'd built up from the tea, or maybe it was just the ritual of taking time for something gentle before facing the day. But that cup of tea had created this little buffer zone between me and the winter. I've started making tea every cold morning since then. It's become this small ceremony that makes even the worst weather feel manageable. Sometimes the simplest pleasures are the most powerful ones. That story is over. There's something so fundamentally comforting about warming up from the inside out on a cold morning. It's like creating your own little pocket of spring when the world outside is still frozen solid. Those small rituals can make even the harshest conditions feel bearable. Our next story takes us to a different kind of peaceful discovery, one that involves finding the perfect spot to just exist for a while. I've always been the type of person who needs to keep moving. Even as a kid, I couldn't sit still for long without getting restless or bored. My mind is constantly jumping from one thing to the next, making lists, planning ahead, worrying about deadlines. It's exhausting sometimes, but it's just how I'm wired. Last summer, I was visiting my grandmother, who lives in this tiny town in Vermont. She's been in the same house for 40 years, and it sits right at the edge of where the neighbourhood ends and the woods begin. Behind her property, there's this network of walking trails that the local conservation group maintains. I'd been staying with her for about a week, helping her organise some old photo albums and fix a few things around the house. It was nice spending time with her, but by day 6 I was feeling cooped up. I needed to move, to explore something new, so I decided to follow one of the trails that started right behind her back fence. The path was well marked with little wooden signs, winding through maple and birch trees that created this natural canopy overhead. It wasn't a difficult hike, just a gentle incline that curved back and forth through the forest. About 20 minutes in, I came to a fork in the path. The main trail continued to the right, but there was this smaller, less obvious path that veered left. The wooden sign just said stream access, with an arrow pointing down the left fork. I decided to follow the smaller path, which led me down a gentle slope toward the sound of running water. After maybe 5 more minutes of walking, I emerged into this small clearing where a narrow stream cut through the forest. And right there, spanning the stream, was the most perfect little wooden bridge I'd ever seen. It wasn't fancy or elaborate, just a simple structure, maybe 8 feet long, with sturdy railings on both sides. The wood had weathered to this beautiful grey colour that blended perfectly with the surrounding trees. I walked to the middle of the bridge and leaned against the railing to look down at the water flowing beneath. The stream wasn't deep, maybe 2 feet at most, but the water was incredibly clear. I could see smooth stones on the bottom and tiny fish darting back and forth in the shadows. The sound of the water was hypnotic, not loud or rushing, just this constant gentle murmur as it flowed around rocks and fallen branches. It was like nature's version of white noise, blocking out everything except the immediate moment. I stood there for what felt like a few minutes, but when I checked my phone, almost an hour had passed. For the first time in months, maybe years, my mind had gone completely quiet. I wasn't thinking about work or planning my next move or worrying about anything. I was just existing in that space between the trees, listening to water flow beneath my feet. The bridge became my daily destination for the rest of my visit. Every morning after breakfast, I'd walk that trail and spend at least 30 minutes just standing there, watching the stream. Sometimes I'd see a bird landing to drink from the water. Sometimes leaves would float by like tiny boats. But mostly, I just stood and breathed and felt my mind settle into stillness. When I had to leave Vermont and go back to my normal life, I was genuinely sad to say goodbye to that bridge. It had become more than just a pretty spot in the woods. It was this sanctuary where I'd learned that my restless mind could actually find peace when I gave it permission to stop planning and just be present. I've tried to find similar spots near my home, but nothing quite compares. There's something magical about that particular combination of flowing water, weathered wood, and forest quiet that I haven't been able to replicate. That story is over. Sometimes the most profound peace comes from the simplest places. A little bridge over a stream sounds almost too quaint to be real, but those are often the spots that catch us completely off guard and teach us things about ourselves we didn't know we needed to learn. This next story comes from someone who discovered how a single scent can transform an entire day and create an atmosphere of pure comfort. I've been living in the same apartment for about 3 years now, and it's a decent place. Nothing fancy, but it has good natural light and enough space for me and my cat. The only problem is that it never really felt like home. It felt like a place where I kept my stuff and slept, but not like a sanctuary or refuge from the world. This was particularly obvious during the colder months. My apartment has these big windows that are great in summer, but in winter they let in drafts that make the whole place feel chilly, no matter how high I turn up the heat. I'd spend most of my time bundled up in sweaters, counting the days until spring. Last October, I was walking through this little downtown district near my work when I passed a shop I'd never noticed before. It was one of those small independent stores that sells candles, soaps, and other home goods. The front door was propped open, and the most incredible smell was drifting out onto the sidewalk. I'm not usually someone who gets drawn in by scents, but this one stopped me in my tracks. It was warm and sweet, but not overwhelmingly so, like being wrapped in a cozy blanket while someone baked cookies in the next room. I followed the scent into the store and found myself surrounded by hundreds of candles in glass jars. The smell was coming from a display table near the front, where several candles were burning to let customers sample the fragrances. The one that had caught my attention was labelled Autumn Hearth, and the description said it was a blend of vanilla and cinnamon with hints of apple and wood smoke. I picked up the jar and inhaled deeply. It was exactly the scent I'd been smelling from the sidewalk. The woman working there noticed me lingering over that particular candle and came over to chat. She told me it was one of their most popular fall scents, that people came back year after year to stock up on it. She said customers told her it made their homes feel like a different place entirely. I bought the candle mostly on impulse. It was more expensive than I usually spend on that kind of thing, but something about the scent made me feel like I needed it in my life. When I got home that evening, I lit it immediately. I placed it on my coffee table in the living room and settled onto my couch with a book. Within minutes, my entire apartment smelled like that warm, cozy blend of vanilla and cinnamon. But it wasn't just the smell. Something about the candlelight itself changed the whole atmosphere. The soft, flickering glow made my familiar space feel intimate and peaceful in a way I'd never experienced before. The drafty windows and bland walls didn't matter anymore. My apartment had been transformed into this cocoon of warmth and comfort. I found myself staying home more often. Instead of going out to coffee shops to read or work on my laptop, I'd light that candle and create my own cozy atmosphere right in my living room. Friends started commenting on how inviting my place felt when they came over. The candle lasted for almost 2 months of regular use. As it burned down, I started to panic a little. What if the store was sold out? What if they discontinued this particular scent? I realised how attached I'd become to this simple ritual of lighting that candle and watching my apartment transform. I needn't have worried. When I went back to the store, they had plenty in stock. The woman working there remembered me and smiled when she saw me heading straight for the Autumn Hearth display. I bought 3 this time, so I wouldn't have to worry about running out. That was 2 years ago. And I still light one of those candles almost every evening when I get home from work. It's become this signal to my brain that the workday's over and it's time to relax. The combination of vanilla and cinnamon has become synonymous with home and comfort and peace. Sometimes I think about how such a small thing, a single candle, could have such a big impact on how I experience my living space. But I guess that's how it works sometimes. The simplest additions to our environment can create the most profound changes in how we feel. That story is over. It's amazing how scent has this direct line to our emotions and sense of comfort. A candle that costs less than a meal out somehow transformed an entire living space into a sanctuary. Sometimes, the best home improvements come in small glass jars. Our next story takes us outside to a discovery that proves nature's architecture is often more intricate and beautiful than anything humans can create. I've been trying to grow a proper garden for about 5 years now, with mixed results. I'm definitely more of a beginner than I like to admit, but I keep trying because there's something satisfying about watching things grow that you've planted yourself. My backyard isn't huge, but I've managed to create a few different sections. There's a vegetable patch near the back fence, a small herb garden by the kitchen door, and along the side of the house, I've planted some flowering bushes that the previous owner started. This spring, I decided to expand the flower garden a bit. I wanted to add some native wildflowers that would attract butterflies and bees. I'd read that they were low maintenance, which appealed to someone with my track record of accidentally killing plants. I spent a weekend preparing the soil and planting seeds, feeling pretty proud of myself for finally getting organised early in the growing season. Usually, I wait until midsummer and then wonder why nothing grows properly. About 3 weeks later, I was out there watering the new plantings when I noticed something odd in one of the flowering bushes. It's this lilac bush that blooms beautifully in late spring, with thick branches that create a dense, rounded shape. Tucked into a fork between 2 branches, maybe 4 feet off the ground, was what looked like a small brown bowl. At first, I thought it might be some kind of fungus or maybe a piece of debris that had gotten caught in the branches during a storm. But when I got closer and looked more carefully, I realised I was looking at a bird's nest. Not just any nest, but the most perfectly constructed little home I'd ever seen in real life. It was woven together from dozens of different materials. Thin twigs formed the basic structure, but there were also strips of bark, dried grass, bits of moss, and what looked like strands of animal fur worked into the walls. The inside was lined with the softest-looking materials, tiny feathers and downy plant fibres that created this cozy cup shape. The engineering was incredible. The nest was wedged securely between the branches, protected from wind and rain by the dense foliage above. The entrance was positioned so it faced away from the prevailing weather, but still got morning sunlight. What amazed me most was how well it blended into its surroundings. If I hadn't been standing at just the right angle, looking up into the bush while watering, I never would have noticed it. The brown and grey materials matched the bark and branches perfectly. I crouched down to get a better look without getting too close. The nest was empty, but it looked recently built. The materials were still fresh and tightly woven, not weathered or falling apart like an old nest would be. Over the next few days, I kept checking on it discreetly from my kitchen window. I didn't want to disturb whatever bird had built it, but I was curious to see if anyone was actually living there. On the fourth day, I saw a flash of red near the bush and realised it was a female cardinal. She was carrying something small in her beak, hopping from branch to branch before disappearing into the nest. A few minutes later, she emerged and flew away, presumably to gather more nesting materials. For the next 2 weeks, I watched this daily routine. The cardinal would arrive several times a day, sometimes with food, sometimes with more soft materials to line the nest. Eventually, I spotted what must have been her mate, a bright red male cardinal who would perch nearby while she was in the nest. I never did see any baby birds, which was probably for the best since I would have been tempted to check on them too often. But knowing that my lilac bush was serving as a safe home for a cardinal family made me feel like my garden was truly alive and serving its purpose. Even now, months later, the empty nest is still there. I've decided to leave it in place rather than cleaning it out. It's become this little reminder of the incredible skill and instinct that goes into creating a home, even one made entirely from materials found in nature. That story is over. There's something humbling about discovering that level of craftsmanship happening right in your own backyard without you even knowing it. Birds make architecture look effortless, while creating homes that are perfectly designed for their specific needs and environment. Let's shift to a completely different kind of peaceful moment, one that involves the quiet magic of fog, transforming a familiar landscape into something mysterious and beautiful. I'm an early riser by nature, usually awake by 5:30 even on weekends. Most people think this is crazy, but I love having those quiet hours before the world gets busy. There's something special about being awake when most other people are still sleeping. I live in a neighbourhood that's about half residential and half undeveloped land. There are houses and streets on one side, but the other side borders on this large area of woods and open fields that the county maintains as green space. There's a walking path that runs through this area, starting from a small parking lot near my street and winding for about 2 miles through different types of terrain. Sometimes it goes through dense forest, sometimes across open meadows, and sometimes along the edge of a small pond. I've been walking this path regularly for about 3 years, usually 3 or 4 times a week in the early morning before work. I know every turn, every landmark, every seasonal change that happens along the route. Last month, I woke up one morning and noticed that the weather was different from what had been forecast. Instead of the clear, crisp fall day that was predicted, everything outside my windows looked hazy and grey. When I stepped outside, I realised we were in the middle of a thick fog bank, the kind of fog that doesn't just make things a little misty, but actually transforms the landscape into something completely different. I could barely see the house across the street. The streetlights were still on, creating these soft, diffused glows that faded into grey just a few feet away. Everything was muffled and dreamlike. I almost stayed home because the fog was so thick I wasn't sure I'd be able to follow the walking path safely. But something about the atmosphere was so intriguing that I decided to try it anyway, figuring I could always turn back if visibility got too poor. I made my way to the trailhead, moving slowly and carefully. The familiar parking lot looked completely foreign in the fog. The usual landmarks were invisible, and I had to rely on the feel of the pavement under my feet to find the start of the path. Once I stepped onto the trail, it was like entering another world entirely. The fog wasn't just around me, it was part of everything. It clung to the trees, drifted across the path in slow waves, and seemed to absorb every sound. My footsteps, which usually echoed slightly on the hard-packed dirt path, were completely muffled. Even the sound of my own breathing seemed softer and more distant. It was like walking through a world wrapped in cotton. The strangest part was how the fog created this bubble of visibility around me. I could see maybe 10 feet in any direction, but beyond that everything faded into grey nothingness. It was like being inside a moving sphere of awareness. Trees would emerge from the fog as I approached them, becoming solid and real, then disappear back into the mist as I passed by. The familiar path became an adventure, where each turn revealed something new, even though I'd walked this same route hundreds of times before. About halfway through my usual walk, I came to a section where the path crosses a small wooden bridge over a creek. In normal weather, you can see the water flowing underneath and the trees on both sides stretching into the distance. But in the fog, the bridge seemed to span an endless grey void. I couldn't see the water below or the trees beyond. It was like walking across a bridge, suspended in clouds with no beginning or end visible. I stood in the middle of that bridge for several minutes, just listening to the sound of water flowing somewhere beneath me in the invisible creek. The fog swirled around the bridge railings, occasionally thickening or thinning just enough to give me glimpses of the world below before closing in again. The whole walk took almost twice as long as usual because I kept stopping to experience how different everything felt. When I finally emerged from the trail and made my way home, the fog was starting to lift slightly. By the time I got to work a few hours later, it had burned off completely and turned into the clear, bright day that had originally been forecast. I've hoped for fog like that again, but it's never quite been the same. That particular morning created this perfect combination of thickness and stillness that transformed my familiar neighbourhood into something magical and otherworldly. That story is over. Fog has this incredible ability to make even the most familiar places feel like unexplored territory. It's like nature occasionally decides to redecorate the entire world overnight, creating mystery where there was once predictability. Our next story takes us skyward for one of those perfect timing moments that remind us to look up once in a while. I work at the city observatory, which means I spend a lot of nights looking up at the sky. Usually I'm focused on specific targets through our big telescope, tracking planets or deep space objects for research, but sometimes, during breaks between observations, I'll just step outside and look up with my naked eyes. Last Tuesday was one of those clear, crisp nights where the atmosphere is so stable that stars barely twinkle. I was taking a break around 11:30, just walking around the parking lot to stretch my legs before the next observation session. I happened to glance up toward the northeast, and that's when I saw it. A streak of light appeared out of nowhere, bright white with a slight blue tinge, cutting across the sky faster than anything I'd ever seen. It wasn't like the shooting stars you sometimes catch in your peripheral vision, the ones that make you wonder if you actually saw something or just imagined it. This was unmistakable, brilliant, lasting maybe 3 full seconds as it traced this perfect arc from one horizon toward the other. The trail it left behind glowed for several seconds after the meteor itself had burned up. This faint ghostly line hanging in the darkness, like someone had drawn across the night sky with a phosphorescent marker. What made it even more incredible was the timing. I'd been working at the observatory for almost 2 years, spending countless hours under dark skies, and I'd seen plenty of meteors during that time, but never one this bright, this dramatic, this perfectly positioned right in my line of sight. I stood there for probably 5 more minutes, staring at the spot where it had appeared, hoping maybe there would be another one. But of course that's not how it works. These moments are gifts that arrive exactly once, exactly when you happen to be looking in the right direction at the right time. When I went back inside to continue my work, I kept thinking about the odds. Meteors are hitting our atmosphere constantly, but most of them are too small or too distant to create a display like that. And even when they do, you have to be outside, looking up, focused on the exact right patch of sky at the exact right moment. I tried to describe it to my colleagues the next day, but words don't really capture what it's like to see something moving that fast across something as vast as the night sky. It was like watching the universe show off for a split second. I've started paying more attention during my breaks now, looking up more often, hoping to catch another show like that one. But I also know that part of what made it special was how unexpected it was, how perfectly it interrupted an ordinary Tuesday night with something extraordinary. That story is over. There's something magical about being in exactly the right place, at the right moment to witness the universe putting on a private light show. The fact that it happened to someone who spends their nights studying the sky makes it even more perfect. Like the cosmos decided to reward their dedication with front row seats to something spectacular. This next story comes from someone who rediscovered one of life's simplest pleasures during a particularly difficult week. I'd been having one of those weeks where everything felt heavy, work was stressful, I was dealing with some family issues, and I'd been sleeping poorly for about 10 days straight. You know how it is when multiple problems pile up at once and you start feeling like you're carrying this invisible weight around everywhere you go. Friday evening, I finally finished a project that had been hanging over me for weeks. I submitted the final report around 6 p.m. and realised I had the entire weekend ahead of me with no urgent deadlines for the first time in months. But instead of feeling relieved, I felt completely drained. Like all the adrenaline that had been keeping me going suddenly disappeared and left me hollow. I was too tired to go out, too wired to just go to bed, too scattered to focus on reading or watching anything. I remembered that I had a load of laundry in the dryer that had been sitting there since that morning. Normally I hate folding laundry, always put it off until I'm down to my last clean shirt. But something about the mundane task appealed to me in that moment. When I opened the dryer, a wave of warm air hit my face that smelled like fabric softener and clean cotton. The clothes were still slightly warm, even though they'd been sitting there for hours. I pulled out this thick fleece blanket that I'd thrown in with the regular clothes. It's oversized, probably meant for a king-size bed, even though I only have a double in this soft grey colour that's faded from years of washing. The blanket was perfectly warm, like it had been sitting in front of a fireplace. Without really thinking about it, I wrapped it around my shoulders and immediately felt something inside me relax for the first time all week. It wasn't just the physical warmth, though that was amazing. It was something about the weight of it, the way it enveloped me completely, creating this cocoon of comfort that shut out everything stressful. I ended up sitting on my couch wrapped in that warm blanket for over an hour, not doing anything productive, not checking my phone, not planning the next day, just existing in this bubble of softness and warmth. The blanket gradually cooled to room temperature, but somehow I felt better than I had in days. All those problems that had seemed overwhelming earlier were still there, but they felt manageable again, like I'd been recharged by something as simple as warm fabric straight from the dryer. I've started timing my laundry differently now, making sure I pull things out while they're still warm. There's something therapeutic about wrapping yourself in clothes or blankets that are still holding heat from the dryer. It's such a small pleasure, but it's always available. Whenever I'm having a rough day, I know I can throw a blanket in the dryer for 10 minutes and create this instant comfort zone. Sometimes the best remedies are hiding in the most ordinary places. That story is over. The image of someone finding solace in a warm blanket straight from the dryer is so relatable and comforting. Sometimes when life gets overwhelming, the simplest physical comforts can reset our entire emotional state. It's like a warm hug that's always available whenever you need it most. Our next story takes us to a meadow where someone stumbled upon one of nature's most beautiful, spontaneous gatherings. I've been hiking the same trail system for about 5 years now. It's this network of paths that winds through state forest land about 30 minutes from my house. Nothing too challenging, just rolling hills and mixed forest with the occasional open meadow. There's one particular route I take that's about 4 miles total, starting from the main parking area and making a loop through different types of terrain. About halfway through, the trail opens up into this large meadow that's maybe 2 acres of wildflowers and tall grass. Usually, when I pass through this meadow, it's quiet except for the occasional bird or the sound of wind moving through the grass. Pretty, but not remarkable. Just a peaceful spot to pause and catch my breath before continuing into the woods. Last weekend, I was about an hour into my hike when I emerged from the tree line into this familiar clearing. But something was different. The air itself seemed to be moving in a way that didn't match the gentle breeze I could feel on my skin. That's when I realized the meadow was full of butterflies. Not just a few scattered here and there, but dozens of them, maybe over 100, all moving through the wildflowers like living confetti. They were mostly monarch butterflies, with their distinctive orange and black wings, but there were also smaller yellow ones and some white ones I couldn't identify. They were everywhere, landing on flowers, spiraling up into the air, crossing paths with each other in these intricate dance patterns. I stopped walking and just stood at the edge of the meadow, not wanting to disturb whatever was happening. The butterflies didn't seem bothered by my presence. A few even landed on my backpack and stayed there for several seconds before fluttering away. The whole scene had this dreamlike quality, like I'd stumbled into a fairy tale or a nature documentary. The butterflies moved with such grace and purpose, but also with this sense of joy, like they were celebrating something I couldn't understand. I found out later that I'd probably witnessed part of a migration, where monarchs gather in large groups before continuing their journey south. But in the moment, it felt like pure magic, like the meadow had been transformed into something enchanted. I stayed there for almost 45 minutes, just watching this aerial ballet play out in front of me. Sometimes the butterflies would cluster together on a particularly appealing patch of flowers, creating these living bouquets of orange and yellow. Then they'd all lift off at once and scatter in different directions before regrouping somewhere else. The silence was profound, broken only by the whisper of wings and the soft sound of butterflies landing on flower petals. It was like being inside a living snow globe, except instead of snow, the air was filled with these delicate, colourful creatures. When I finally continued on my hike, I kept looking back at the meadow, hoping to see if the butterflies were still there. But by the time I completed the loop and passed through again on my way back to the parking lot, they had moved on. I've been back to that same meadow probably 10 times since then, always hoping to see something similar. The wildflowers are still beautiful, the space is still peaceful, but it's never been filled with butterflies like that again. That story is over. Witnessing a butterfly migration like that sounds absolutely magical, like stumbling into a moment when nature decides to put on its most beautiful performance. The fact that it happened in a place he'd visited dozens of times before makes it even more special, like the meadow was saving up this surprise for exactly the right moment. This next story comes from someone who discovered that the sound of the ocean could reach them in the most unexpected place. I don't get to travel much, maybe once or twice a year if I'm lucky, so when my aunt offered to let me use her beach cottage for a long weekend while she was out of town, I jumped at the chance. The cottage is about 3 hours from where I live, in this small coastal town that's pretty quiet even during tourist season. It's not one of those fancy beach houses you see in magazines, just a simple 2-bedroom place, about a quarter mile from the actual shoreline. When my aunt was giving me directions, she mentioned that you couldn't see the ocean from the cottage, but you could walk to the beach in about 5 minutes. I was a little disappointed because I'd been looking forward to waking up to an ocean view, but free lodging is free lodging. I arrived Friday evening, just as the sun was setting, exhausted from the drive and from a particularly stressful week at work. I unpacked quickly, grabbed some takeout from town, and was in bed by 9:30, which is early even for me. The bedroom I chose faced the back of the house, away from the street and neighbouring cottages. I opened the window before getting into bed, because I love sleeping with fresh air, and the evening was perfect for it. As I was settling in, I started to notice this sound in the background that I couldn't quite identify. It was rhythmic but irregular, soft but constant, like distant breathing or a very slow heartbeat. It took me several minutes to realise I was hearing waves. Even though the cottage was a quarter mile from the beach, with houses and dunes and probably trees in between, the sound of the ocean was carrying perfectly through my open window. It wasn't loud or overwhelming, just this gentle, persistent rhythm that seemed to sync up with my own breathing. Each wave would build and break, pause, then build and break again, creating this natural metronome that made everything else fade into the background. I'd stayed in beachfront hotels before, but usually the ocean sounds were mixed with traffic noise, other guests, air conditioning units. This was pure and clean, like having a white noise machine that never repeated the same pattern twice. I fell asleep faster than I had in months. Usually my mind races when I first get into bed, going over the day or planning tomorrow or worrying about random things. But something about that steady ocean rhythm just shut down all the mental chatter. I woke up the next morning feeling more rested than I'd felt in years. The waves were still there, a little quieter in the daylight, but still audible through the window. It was like having this constant reminder that something larger and more peaceful than my daily worries was always present, just beyond the dunes. I spent the entire weekend with that window open, even during meals and while reading on the back porch. The ocean sound became the soundtrack to everything, this underlying sense of calm that made even mundane activities feel restorative. When I had to pack up and drive home Sunday evening, I was genuinely sad to leave that sound behind. My own bedroom at home felt too quiet, too isolated from the natural world. I've been back to that cottage twice since then, always requesting the same bedroom, always opening that same window. There's something about falling asleep to the sound of waves that creates the deepest, most peaceful rest I've ever experienced. That story is over. There's something so primal and comforting about the sound of waves that it can reach you even when you can't see the water. The ocean becomes this invisible presence that wraps around you and pulls you into its rhythm, creating the perfect natural lullaby. Let's move to a story about discovering beauty in something as fleeting and delicate as falling petals. I live in a neighbourhood that was developed about 30 years ago, and whoever designed it had the foresight to plant cherry trees along most of the streets. Not the fruit-bearing kind, but the ornamental ones that explode into clouds of pink and white blossoms every spring. For most of the year, these trees blend into the background. They're just part of the landscaping, providing shade and structure, but nothing particularly noteworthy. But for about 2 weeks in early April, they transform the entire neighbourhood into something magical. This spring, the blooming happened to coincide with a stretch of perfect weather. Warm days, cool nights, just enough rain to keep everything fresh, but not so much that it knocked the petals off prematurely. I was walking home from the grocery store one afternoon, carrying 2 bags and thinking about what to make for dinner, when I noticed something that made me stop completely. The sidewalk in front of me was covered with cherry blossom petals, but not in the messy, trampled way you might expect. Instead, they had fallen in this perfect, even layer, like someone had deliberately scattered them there. Each petal was intact and positioned just so, creating this soft pink carpet that stretched for about half a block. What made it even more beautiful was that more petals were still falling. A gentle breeze would move through the trees, and dozens of petals would drift down, like the world's most delicate snowstorm. They fell slowly, spinning and floating rather than dropping straight down. I set my grocery bags on someone's front steps and just stood there watching this natural confetti show. Some petals would land on my shoulders or in my hair. Others would settle on parked cars, mailboxes and front lawns, turning the whole street into something out of a fairy tale. The air smelled incredibly sweet, but not overwhelming. Just this gentle floral scent that made every breath feel like a small gift. Combined with the visual of all those pink petals drifting through the afternoon sunlight, it was almost overwhelming how beautiful it was. I ended up walking the long way home, following streets where the cherry trees were thickest, just to extend this experience. Each block offered a slightly different view of the same phenomenon. Sometimes the petals were pale pink, sometimes deeper rose, sometimes pure white, depending on the variety of tree. What struck me most was how temporary it all was. These trees had been building up to this moment all year, growing buds, preparing for their brief spectacular display. And in just a few days, all the petals would be gone, swept up or washed away, leaving behind green leaves and the memory of this fleeting beauty. By the time I got home, my hair and clothes were covered with petals. I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and carefully removed each one, not wanting to just brush them off carelessly. They were so delicate, so perfectly formed, like tiny works of art that had travelled from branch to ground to become part of my afternoon. I pressed a few between the pages of a book, thinking maybe I could preserve something from that perfect day. But I know the real beauty wasn't in the individual petals. It was in the experience of walking through that gentle storm of falling blossoms. That story is over. There's something almost magical about cherry blossom season, like nature saves up all its artistry for those few perfect weeks when the trees turn into living snow globes. The fact that it's so temporary makes it even more precious, like the world is giving you a brief glimpse of what paradise might look like. Our final story takes us to a quiet corner where someone found the perfect refuge from the busy world. I'm not much of a library person usually. I do most of my reading at home or on my commute, and when I need to research something, I typically just use the internet. But last fall, I found myself in a situation where I needed a quiet place to work on a freelance project that required several hours of uninterrupted focus. My apartment wasn't going to work because my upstairs neighbours were having their floors refinished, which meant constant hammering and sanding during the day. Coffee shops were too noisy and distracting. I needed somewhere that was quiet, free, and where I could spread out my papers without bothering anyone. That's how I ended up at the main branch of our city library for the first time in probably 10 years. It's this beautiful, old Carnegie building with high ceilings and tall windows, the kind of place that makes you feel like you should be more scholarly just by walking through the doors. I asked the librarian at the information desk where I might find a quiet spot to work for a few hours. She directed me upstairs to the reference section, which she said was usually pretty empty during weekday afternoons. I climbed the wide marble staircase to the second floor and found myself in this amazing room with floor-to-ceiling bookshelves, long wooden tables, and these incredible tall windows that let in streams of natural light. But what caught my attention immediately was this corner area that had been set up differently from the rest of the room. Instead of the formal wooden tables and hard chairs, there were several comfortable-looking armchairs arranged around small side tables with good reading lamps positioned next to each chair. One chair in particular drew me over. It was positioned in the corner where two walls of windows met, so it got light from two directions. It was this deep, cushioned chair in dark green leather that looked like it had been broken in by years of readers settling into it with good books. I tested it out and immediately felt like I'd found the perfect spot. The chair was exactly the right height and firmness, with arms wide enough to rest notebooks on, and a back that supported me without being too upright or too reclined. From that corner, I could see most of the reference room, but I also felt tucked away and private. The windows next to me looked out over a small courtyard with mature trees, so even the view was peaceful and conducive to concentration. I settled in with my project materials and quickly discovered that this chair had some kind of magical focusing power. Maybe it was the combination of natural light, comfortable seating, and the scholarly atmosphere of the room, but I got more work done in 3 hours than I usually accomplish in an entire day at home. The room stayed quiet but not silent. There was the occasional whisper of pages turning, the soft footsteps of people moving between the stacks, the distant sound of traffic from outside. But it all blended into this perfect background that helped rather than hindered my concentration. When I finally packed up my things around 4:00, I felt reluctant to leave. That chair had become my temporary office, my thinking spot, my refuge from the noisy world outside. I've been back to that same chair probably twice a week ever since. It's become my regular spot for any project that requires deep thinking or careful attention to detail. I've never found anyone else sitting in it, which makes me wonder if other people haven't discovered how perfect it is, or if somehow it's been waiting there just for me. Sometimes I bring actual books instead of work, and I'll spend an entire Saturday afternoon reading in that corner, while afternoon light moves across the pages. The chair holds me like an old friend, while I lose myself in stories or ideas. I've started thinking of it as my chair, even though it belongs to the library and the public. But there's something about the way it fits me, the way the light falls just right, the way it makes even difficult work feel manageable, that makes it feel like it was designed specifically for my needs. That story is over. There's something so satisfying about finding the perfect reading spot, especially in a place as timeless as a Carnegie library. That green leather chair sounds like it's been waiting decades for the right person to fully appreciate its combination of comfort and scholarly atmosphere. Sometimes the most profound moments happen when we least expect them. This next story comes from someone who discovered that the most ordinary evening can suddenly become extraordinary with just the right conditions. I moved to this small apartment about 8 months ago, and there's a tiny balcony that overlooks a community pond. It's nothing fancy, just one of those man-made water features that developers put in to make their housing complex seem more upscale. Most days I barely notice it. The pond sits in the centre of our little neighbourhood, maybe 50 yards across, surrounded by a walking path and some landscaping. During the day it's pleasant enough, with a few ducks and the occasional jogger, but nothing that would make you stop and stare. Last Thursday night I was having trouble sleeping again. Work had been stressful, and my mind was doing that thing where it cycles through every conversation from the day, analysing what I should have said differently. Around midnight I gave up on sleep and stepped out onto my balcony for some fresh air. The night was unusually clear for our area. We don't usually get skies this transparent because of light pollution from the city nearby, but something about the atmospheric conditions that night made everything crisp and visible. When I looked down at the pond, I had to blink several times because what I was seeing didn't seem real. The water was completely still, like a sheet of black glass, and reflected in that perfect surface was every single star in the sky above. It wasn't just a few bright stars scattered here and there. I could see the entire Milky Way stretching across the water's surface, creating this incredible mirror image of the heavens. The reflection was so perfect that for a moment I felt dizzy, like I was looking down into infinite space instead of a shallow pond. I stood there gripping the balcony railing, trying to process what I was seeing. Above me was the real night sky, and below was its exact twin, so clearly reflected that I couldn't tell where reality ended and reflection began. It was like standing between two universes. The longer I stared, the more details I could make out in the water. Individual stars, the subtle glow of distant galaxies, even the faint band of cosmic dust that makes up the Milky Way. Everything was there, perfectly duplicated in the still surface below. I must have stood on that balcony for over an hour, just absorbing this incredible display. A few times a gentle breeze would threaten to disturb the surface, but somehow the water remained glass smooth throughout the entire experience. The most surreal part was the silence. No traffic, no air conditioning units humming, no distant voices. Just me and this perfect cosmic mirror, as if the whole world had paused to let this moment exist. When I finally went back inside around 1:30, I felt this incredible sense of peace that I hadn't experienced in months. All the work stress and daily anxieties that had been keeping me awake just seemed insignificant compared to what I'd witnessed. I've checked that pond dozens of times since then, hoping to see the same phenomenon again. The conditions have never been quite right. There's always a breeze or clouds or the water level is different. But that one perfect night showed me something I'll never forget. That story is over. The universe really does save its most incredible performances for the people who need them most. Standing between two infinite skies sounds like the kind of experience that changes your perspective on everything, especially during those restless nights when sleep feels impossible. Our next story comes from someone who rediscovered one of life's most fundamental pleasures, right in their own backyard. I work from home doing freelance web design, which means I spend most of my day staring at computer screens in my home office. It's good work and I enjoy it, but sometimes I realize I've gone entire days without really stepping outside or connecting with anything natural. Last week was particularly intense. I had 3 different client projects due on the same day, each one requiring completely different skills and approaches. By Tuesday afternoon, I was feeling that familiar tension in my shoulders and neck that comes from hunching over a keyboard for too long. Around 3 p.m. I decided I needed a break before my brain completely fried. Instead of making another cup of coffee or scrolling through my phone, I walked out to my backyard. There's this massive oak tree that dominates the entire space, probably planted decades before my house was even built. The afternoon was perfect in that subtle way that makes you grateful for whatever weather patterns created it, warm but not hot, with this gentle breeze that made all the leaves whisper together in this continuous, soothing sound. I grabbed one of those outdoor cushions from my patio furniture and positioned it right under the center of the tree. When I lay down and looked up, the canopy created this natural dome above me, with thousands of leaves filtering the sunlight into these constantly shifting patterns. The light coming through wasn't harsh or blinding. Instead, it created these soft golden patches that moved and danced across my face as the branches swayed. Every few seconds, the pattern would change completely, like watching a kaleidoscope made of sunshine and shadow. I could hear the leaves rustling overhead, this gentle, constant sound that somehow managed to be both steady and ever-changing. It was like nature's version of white noise, but organic and alive in a way that no machine could replicate. Cars were passing on the street in front of my house, and I could hear neighbours going about their daily routines. But all of that seemed distant and unimportant. Under this tree, time moved differently. The urgent deadlines and client revisions that had been consuming my thoughts just faded into background noise. What started as a quick 15-minute break stretched into almost an hour. I wasn't sleeping exactly, but I wasn't fully conscious either, just existing in this space between earth and sky, letting the tree's presence wash over me. When I finally got up and went back inside, I felt completely reset. My shoulders had relaxed, my mind was clear, and those same problems that had seemed overwhelming earlier now felt manageable and even interesting. The rest of my workday flowed smoothly. I finished all 3 projects ahead of schedule and actually enjoyed the process instead of grinding through it. That hour under the oak had given me back my perspective and energy. I've made it a daily ritual now. Every afternoon around 3 p.m. I take my cushion outside and spend at least 20 minutes under that tree. It's become my favourite part of working from home, this guaranteed pocket of peace in the middle of whatever chaos the day might bring. That story is over. Sometimes the best office upgrade isn't a new monitor or ergonomic chair. It's remembering that nature designed the perfect workspace millions of years ago. An hour under an old oak tree can reset your entire relationship with whatever stress you're carrying. Here's a story about timing, weather, and how the universe occasionally decides to apologize for ruining your plans. I had been planning this outdoor birthday celebration for weeks. Not just a casual backyard gathering, but a full-scale event with 30 people invited, a whole menu designed around grilling, lawn games set up across my yard, and decorations that had taken me hours to arrange perfectly. The weather forecast had been promising clear skies all week, so I felt confident about hosting everything outside. My friends started arriving around 2 Saturday afternoon, and for the first couple hours, everything was absolutely perfect. The food was turning out great, people were laughing and enjoying themselves, and I was thinking this might be one of the best birthdays I'd ever celebrated. Then around 4:30, these ominous dark clouds started building on the horizon. I'm talking about clouds so thick and black, they looked like they were carrying night with them. The wind picked up dramatically, and you could smell that distinctive scent of approaching rain from miles away. Within 20 minutes, we went from perfect party weather to the kind of storm that makes you question whether you should be standing outside. The rain didn't gradually begin, it attacked. Heavy sheets of water driven by wind strong enough to knock over the patio furniture I'd spent the morning arranging. Everyone scrambled inside, soaked and laughing, but clearly disappointed. We managed to save most of the food, but the outdoor celebration vibe was completely destroyed. I tried to hide my frustration, but internally I felt like weeks of planning had been washed away in minutes. The storm raged for about 40 minutes of intense rain, thunder, and wind. We made the best of it inside, but I kept looking out the windows, feeling sorry for myself, and all the effort that seemed wasted. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the storm stopped. The rain cut off like someone had turned off a massive faucet. The clouds began breaking apart, and late afternoon sunlight started streaming through the gaps in the sky. My friend Zoe was the first to notice what was happening outside. She was looking through my kitchen window when she suddenly gasped and pointed toward the backyard. "Everyone needs to see this right now," she said, with genuine awe in her voice. We all crowded around the windows and sliding doors to look outside. Stretching across the entire sky, from one edge of the horizon to the other, was the most spectacular rainbow I'd ever witnessed in my life. This wasn't just a partial arc that you glimpsed between buildings. It was a complete, perfect semicircle of brilliant colours spanning my entire neighbourhood. Every stripe was distinct and vivid, from deep red on the outer edge to violet on the inside. But what made it even more incredible was that a second rainbow appeared above the first one, fainter but clearly visible, with the colours reversed in that mysterious way that double rainbows work. Two perfect arcs stretching across the storm-cleared sky, like nature's apology. Everyone rushed outside into my soggy backyard to get the full effect. We stood there dripping from the earlier downpour, staring up at this incredible display that seemed to have been created specifically for my birthday celebration. The rainbow lasted for maybe 25 minutes before gradually fading as the sun moved lower. But those 25 minutes transformed the entire day from a weather disaster into the most memorable birthday I've ever had. People are still talking about it weeks later. Instead of remembering the party that got rained out, everyone remembers the birthday where we witnessed the most amazing double rainbow together. Sometimes nature has better entertainment planned than anything we could organise ourselves. That story is over. Getting a personal double rainbow as compensation for a ruined party sounds like the universe's way of saying sorry in the most spectacular way possible. Sometimes the best celebrations are the ones that abandon the script entirely and let nature take over the entertainment. Let's shift to something completely different. A story about finding the perfect ritual to face even the harshest winter mornings. I live in northern Wisconsin, where winter isn't just a season, it's a test of endurance. We're talking about months where the temperature stays below freezing, where your car might not start some mornings, where stepping outside feels like walking into a freezer that's been set to punish you personally. This particular February morning was brutal, even by our standards. The thermometer outside my kitchen window read -22 degrees. not accounting for the wind chill that was making everything worse. There was frost forming on the inside of my windows, which is never a good sign. I had to be at work by 8 halvsig, which meant leaving the house at 7:30 to give my car enough time to warm up properly. But before facing that Arctic blast, I needed something to fortify myself against what felt like nature's attempt to freeze me solid. Coffee wasn't going to be enough. I needed something more warming, more ceremonial, something that would create a buffer between me and the hostile world outside my door. I remembered a box of chamomile tea with honey that had been sitting in my pantry for months, untouched. I'm usually a coffee person, but something about this particular morning called for tea. I filled my electric kettle and set it to boil while I found my largest mug. It's this oversized ceramic piece that my sister gave me for Christmas, painted with tiny blue flowers and big enough that you need both hands to hold it properly. While waiting for the water to heat up, I stood at my kitchen window, watching the winter landscape. Everything was covered in thick frost that made the world look like it had been carved from crystal. The bare tree branches looked like they'd been dipped in silver, and even the power lines had this delicate coating of ice that caught the early morning light. When the kettle clicked off, I poured the steaming water over the tea bag and watched the golden colour slowly bloom through the liquid. The steam rose up in perfect spirals, and I could already smell the gentle blend of chamomile and honey mixing together. I wrapped both hands around the warm ceramic and brought the mug close to my face. The steam created this little microclimate of warmth and humidity, like having a personal sauna right there in my frozen kitchen. The first sip was exactly what I needed, warm enough to spread through my chest and stomach, but not so hot it burned my tongue. The honey provided just the right amount of sweetness, and the chamomile had this soothing, almost floral quality that seemed to calm everything inside me. I stood there for maybe 10 minutes, just holding that mug and letting the tea work its magic. The warmth was radiating through my hands and up my arms, while the steam continued to create this pocket of comfort around my face. Even though I knew I'd have to face the brutal cold in just a few minutes, that tea had created this protective layer of warmth and calm that made the prospect seem manageable instead of torturous. When I finally had to leave for work, the cold didn't hit quite as hard as expected. Maybe it was the internal warmth I'd built up, or maybe it was just the ritual of taking time for something gentle before facing the harsh world outside. I've made tea every frigid morning since then. It's become this essential ceremony that transforms even the most punishing weather into something I can handle with grace. That story is over. There's something almost magical about creating your own pocket of warmth when the world outside is actively trying to freeze you. That 10-minute tea ritual probably did more to prepare for winter than any amount of layered clothing ever could. This next story takes us to a completely different kind of discovery, one that happened during a visit to family in an unfamiliar place. I was staying with my grandmother for a week last summer, helping her organise some old family photos and taking care of a few repairs around her house. She lives in this small Vermont town where she's been for over 30 years, in a place where the neighbourhood gradually fades into wilderness at the edges. Behind her property, there's this network of walking trails maintained by the local conservation group. I'd been inside for most of the week, working on indoor projects, but by day 5 I was feeling restless and needed to move around outside. I decided to explore one of the trails that started right behind her back fence. The path was clearly marked with small wooden signs, winding through maple and birch trees that created this natural canopy overhead. It wasn't challenging, just a gentle incline that curved back and forth through the forest. About 15 minutes in, I came to a fork where the main trail continued straight, but a smaller path branched off to the left. A weathered wooden sign simply said, "Stream access," with an arrow pointing down the narrower route. I decided to follow the side path, which led me down a gradual slope toward the sound of running water. After maybe 5 more minutes of walking, I emerged into a small clearing where a narrow stream cut through the forest. Spanning the water was the most charming little wooden bridge I'd ever encountered. Nothing fancy or elaborate, just a simple structure, maybe 6 feet long, with sturdy railings on both sides. The wood had weathered to this beautiful grey colour that blended perfectly with the surrounding trees. I walked to the centre of the bridge and leaned against the railing to look down at the water flowing beneath. The stream wasn't deep, maybe 18 inches at most, but the water was incredibly clear. I could see smooth stones on the bottom and tiny fish darting between the shadows cast by overhanging branches. The sound of the water was hypnotic, not loud or rushing, just this constant, gentle murmur as it flowed around rocks and fallen branches. It was like nature's perfect background music, blocking out everything except the immediate present moment. I intended to stand there for just a few minutes, but when I checked my phone later, almost an hour had passed. For the first time in months, my mind had gone completely quiet. No mental to-do lists, no work anxiety, no planning ahead, just existing in that space above the flowing water. The bridge became my daily destination for the rest of my visit. Every morning after breakfast with my grandmother, I'd walk that trail and spend at least 30 minutes just standing there, listening to the stream flow beneath my feet. Sometimes I'd see a bird land to drink from the water. Occasionally, leaves would float by like tiny boats on a miniature river. But mostly, I just stood there and felt my restless mind settle into a stillness I'd forgotten was possible. When I had to leave Vermont and return to my regular life, saying goodbye to that bridge felt like leaving behind a piece of myself. It had become more than just a scenic spot. It was this sanctuary where I'd rediscovered what it felt like to be completely present. I've tried to find similar places near my home, but nothing quite compares to that particular combination of flowing water, weathered wood, and forest quiet. Some places just have their own magic that can't be replicated anywhere else. That story is over. There's something about standing over flowing water that seems to sync up with something deep inside us, like the stream's rhythm reminds our minds how to find their own natural pace. Sometimes the most profound peace comes from the simplest wooden bridges. Our next story comes from someone who discovered how a single scent can completely transform a living space and create an atmosphere of pure comfort. I'd been living in the same apartment for almost 2 years, and while it was perfectly adequate, it never really felt like home. It was just the place where I kept my belongings and slept, but not somewhere that felt like a refuge or sanctuary from the outside world. This was especially noticeable during the colder months, when the big windows that were great in summer became sources of drafts that made the whole place feel chilly and unwelcoming, no matter how high I turned the thermostat. Last autumn I was walking through the downtown area after work when I passed a small shop I'd never noticed before. It was one of those independent stores that sells candles, bath products, and other home goods. The front door was propped open and the most incredible smell was drifting out onto the sidewalk. I'm not usually someone who gets drawn in by fragrances, but this particular scent stopped me completely. It was warm and inviting without being overwhelming, like the essence of comfort itself had been bottled and released into the air. I followed the smell into the store and found myself surrounded by hundreds of candles in glass jars. The fragrance was coming from a display near the entrance where several candles were burning to let customers experience the different scents. The one that had caught my attention was labelled Autumn Hearth, described as a blend of vanilla and cinnamon with notes of apple and wood smoke. I picked up the jar and inhaled deeply, and it was exactly the warmth I had been smelling from outside. The woman working there noticed me lingering over that particular candle and mentioned that it was one of their most popular seasonal fragrances. She said customers would return year after year, specifically to stock up on this scent, claiming it completely changed how their homes felt. I bought the candle somewhat impulsively, spending more than I usually would on that kind of purchase, but something about the fragrance made it feel essential rather than optional. When I got home that evening, I lit it immediately and placed it on my coffee table. Within minutes, my entire apartment smelled like that perfect blend of vanilla, cinnamon, and subtle wood smoke. But the transformation went beyond just the scent. The soft, flickering candlelight created this intimate atmosphere that made my familiar space feel completely different. The drafty windows and plain walls didn't matter anymore because the whole apartment had been wrapped in this cocoon of warmth and comfort. I found myself wanting to stay home more often instead of going out to coffee shops or restaurants. I'd light that candle and create my own cozy environment right in my living room. Friends started commenting on how inviting and peaceful my place felt when they visited. The candle lasted for almost 3 months of regular use, and as it burned down, I started to worry about what would happen when it was gone. I'd become so attached to this simple ritual of lighting it each evening and watching my apartment transform. When I went back to the store, they had plenty in stock, and the woman remembered me immediately. I bought 4 this time, ensuring I wouldn't have to worry about running out of this magic that had turned my apartment into an actual home. That story is over. It's incredible how something as simple as the right scent can flip a switch in your brain and turn a generic living space into a personal sanctuary. Sometimes home isn't about the furniture or the location, it's about finding the right atmosphere to wrap around yourself. Let's move to a story about discovering one of nature's most intricate architectural achievements hidden in plain sight. I've been trying to maintain a decent garden for about 3 years now, with results that could charitably be called mixed. I'm definitely more enthusiastic than skilled, but I keep trying because there's something satisfying about working with plants and soil, even when things don't grow exactly as planned. My backyard isn't huge, but I've managed to create a few different areas. There's a small vegetable patch near the back fence, some herbs planted close to the kitchen door, and along the side of the house, I've been nurturing some flowering bushes that were already established when I moved in. This spring I decided to expand the garden a bit by adding some native wildflowers that would attract butterflies and bees. I'd read that they were relatively low maintenance, which appealed to someone with my track record of accidentally killing plants through either too much or too little attention. I spent a weekend preparing a new section of soil and planting seeds, feeling optimistic about getting organised early in the growing season for once. Usually, I procrastinate until midsummer and then wonder why nothing flourishes properly. About 3 weeks later, I was out there watering the new plantings when I noticed something unusual in one of the established flowering bushes. It's a lilac that blooms beautifully each year, with thick branches that create this dense, rounded shape. Tucked into a fork between 2 branches, maybe 3 feet off the ground, was what initially looks like a small brown bowl, or maybe some kind of debris that had gotten lodged there during a recent storm. But when I moved closer and examined it more carefully, I realised I was looking at a bird's nest. Not just any nest, but the most perfectly engineered little structure I'd ever seen up close. It was woven together from dozens of different materials. Thin twigs formed the basic framework, but there were also strips of bark, dried grass, bits of moss, and what appeared to be strands of animal fur, all worked into the walls with incredible precision. The interior was lined with the softest materials imaginable. Tiny feathers and downy plant fibres had been arranged to create this perfectly cushioned cup shape that looked more comfortable than some human furniture I've encountered. What amazed me most was the engineering. The nest was positioned perfectly between the branches for maximum stability, protected from weather by the dense foliage above, but still positioned to catch morning sunlight. The craftsmanship was so precise that it blended almost invisibly into its surroundings. If I hadn't been standing at exactly the right angle while watering, I never would have spotted it. The brown and grey materials matched the bark and branches so perfectly it seemed designed by a master camouflage artist. Well, that brings us to the end of tonight's collection of peaceful moments from the quieter corners of the internet. These stories remind us that sometimes the most beautiful experiences aren't the ones we plan or chase after, but the ones that find us when we're open enough to notice them. I hope these stories gave you that same sense of calm that drew me to them in the first place. Sometimes we need reminders that the world can be gentle, that there are still pockets of magic hidden in ordinary days, and that peace is often just a deep breath away. Sweet dreams, everyone, and thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight.